This just in, the California Senate has voted to approve a bill that would cap rent increases for most tenants across the state. Under the measure, annual rent increases would be capped at 5% plus inflation for housing built more than 15 years ago.
The governor calls this the strongest package of renter and anti-eviction protections in the state. The bill is waiting to be signed by Governor Gavin Newsom. Under the bill, landlords would only be able to raise rent annually by 5% plus inflation. It would also require landlords to have a just cause before ousting tenants that lived in the apartment for at least a year. If a landlord wishes to evict a tenant to remodel, they will have to pay a relocation fee.
Listen up, because this is a pretty big deal. AB 1482 essentially makes rent control law of the land in California. There's only one other state in the country to do this, and that's Oregon. Under this new law, for the next decade, landlords will only be able to raise rent for an existing tenant by 5% after inflation.
So the government, being as smart as it is, has decided that the way to fix the housing crisis is by stymieing the growth of your rental income. And Governor Gavin Newsom actually sent these calculators as the consolation prize to this new bill. And they actually were nice enough to black out all the numbers they think you don't need. And they left you the 5 and the percent sign, because that's how much your income's going to grow every year for the next decade. Now, with the ramp up of this whole rent control thing, and it's really crazy when you think about how it came to be. It went from nothing to something literally like in a 3-month period. There was a lot of talk, and then all of a sudden, now it's sitting on the governor's desk waiting for signature. But the thing to be cognizant of is it's not the only thing that's going to play a role in terms of the growth of your rentals. We have a situation right now where in other tenant landlord law, you may have had a building that previously had a no smoking, no pet policy, and this is what some of your units look like now. Because with the inception of the comfort animal and the legalization of a pseudo-legal drug, marijuana, now in your non-smoking, non-pet building, like the way my wife and I run our buildings, now for any good reason with a letter from the doctor, they can smoke and have any type of animal, I assume. So aside of rent control, while we are going to speak at length, and by the time you exit these doors, you're going to have a firm grasp of how to navigate your multifamily business, it's not the only topic to be concerned with. You have a situation right now where there was just a lowering of interest rates, which on the superficial level sounds like a good thing if you assume that all rates are tied to the Fed rate. But at the same time, they announced, they're not calling it this yet, but they've announced quantitative easing. And so if we're not familiar with what that means, that has not happened since 2008. Anyone remember 2008? So what does the government see that they're not sharing with us? And so we need to have the information necessary so that we're not blindsided when there's a shift in the economy. We've had the Trump tax code now for over 1.5 years. And with it came a beautiful gift. With that gift came a 20% deduction right off the top of your rental income. But many of you, I assume, are not holding title in the right entity to take advantage of the 20%. Aside of taxes, what's going on in the housing market? You know, we've had this huge run-up in rental rates. Now, was that supposed to just happen? Or are we the beneficiaries of individuals who, over the last decade, could not buy homes, but now with the lowering of interest rates are going to opt to be homeowners, and so we have an issue of supply and demand. Coupled with that, we have more Californians that are leaving the state than are entering from other states, going back to supply and demand. So, again, rent control is an issue, but we need to have a firm grasp of these other issues that will also affect our ownership. Now, there's been 2 groups of investors that I talked to as we've approached the event. There's those that are the pessimists that think along with rent control comes the death of the landlord, that all the financial rewards and gains that are associated with owning multifamily properties will no longer be there. And some go as far as to say that they're no longer going to grow their portfolio, that they see no need. They point to this new law as their justification, rationalization. Truth be told, over the last 5 or 10 years, when we just had a big explosion in values of rents, they hadn't repositioned or made any transitions even prior to rent control, but they're using this now as their justification to stay pat. You have another pool of investors, and I'm going to assume that's the vast majority of us here because you've come actually to be educated. Thousands were invited, yet only 300 come. So I'm going to assume this room are the optimists. And so while rent control maybe is not convenient, we're going to learn what there is to know about the law. We're going to learn to operate within its confines, but we're never going to take our gaze off what's most important, and that's the growth of our financial legacy. We're not going to let Gavin Newsom or any other of his cronies determine or change the trajectory of what we had already had in mind when it came to our financial goals. So to give you some context of where this afternoon is headed, because right now rent control is the talk of the town, it is the news of the day. But if we go to 2008, in 2008, I'm sure we can all agree that the economy was rip-roaring. Your stock portfolios look great. Unemployment was at its lowest rate. Not so much? Not so much. No, in 2008, we look back at that now and we call that the Great Recession of real estate. And in 2008, that was the talk of the town, that you had the financial markets that had collapsed, you had the housing market that had collapsed. Our economy was on tilt. And so at that time, you had investors who were fearful of all the blood in the street, to quote Warren Buffett, that they didn't know where to pivot, and it was from a lack of information. Now, at the same time in 2008, they say every dark cloud has a silver lining. I don't know if this is a silver lining, but I was a new licensee in 2008. So the standing joke is I got my real estate license on Monday, and God in his humor on Wednesday decided that the markets should collapse. And it was within the rubble of those days that I started to build my multifamily business. So at that time, wanting to assist my personal clients, again, just starting out, what, as the realtor, could I do to assist them so that they wouldn't become a victim to the marketplace, but they actually could outpace the average investor who had bought into fear and the psychology of the market? As I considered my options, I said, well, not everything is transactional. Not everyone is looking to buy or sell an apartment building today, so what do they need? They need information. What type of information do they need? They need information that can help them continue to move their financial legacy forward. And as I looked at multifamily ownership, I realized that it's really like a three-legged stool. The first leg of the stool is maximization. First, we have to get a hold of what it is we currently own. I can't tell you how many investors I've talked to since this whole rent control thing that tell me this. I kid you not. Chris, you know what, the passage of rent control, I'm really gonna have to raise my rents every year now. They got caught flat-footed. And I have plenty of clients in this room who can vouch for me. For the last 10 years, from this stage, we've been yelling from the rooftops, raise your rents, go after a different tenant demographic. It impacts the value. Now with rent control here, what do we have? We have a situation, speaking personally, I had a building in escrow one day. News comes out that the state senate passed rent control. The buyer, who's non-contingent and his deposit is non-refundable, said, I don't care, I'll walk away from my deposit, cancel the deal. Because the value of that building has now changed. The value of your property, I know that we maybe don't want to admit it. I have other investors who say, Chris, I want you to tell me how much my property's worth, but I'm not going to give you my rent roll. And with that, I know what they mean. It's because they know their rents are severely low. They don't want me to pin a true value. They want me to pin a hope value to it based assuming the wrong rents. It matters. So we have to get control of what it is that we currently own through capital improvements. Now, along with this rent control bill, they gave us an incentive to do capital improvements, and you can get around the 5% cap. And we're going to talk about that this afternoon. So if you do the right capital improvements and you raise your rents, and there's some growing pains with that, but once you raise your rents, you've increased the valuation of your property. So now you can do one of two things, because now you essentially have more equity. You can cash out and refinance to pivot to grow and buy more real estate. You can do a 1031 exchange and truly move into pillar 2, which is growth. Now, I'm going to speak to growth as it's a positive thing. Growth meaning more units is better than less, more net income is better than less. And while each of us have our own investor story, truly there's only 3 or 4 types of investors in the room. There's those who currently, your investment properties represent the vast majority of your retirement income. So any growth in net income means an increase in your standard of living. There's those who are currently working or running a business, like my wife and myself, who are buying multifamily properties now. And yes, maybe they subsidize your income somewhat today, but the real goal is that they will represent the vast majority of your income come retirement. So any growth in the number of units or any growth in your net income over time means an increase of standard of living later. Then there's those of you that are on the last stage, if you will. You're holding what it is that you want to hold, and you have the next generation in mind. Well, the next generation are going to need more income in their lifetime than you've needed in yours to create the same standard of living. Would you agree with that? Your children, your grandchildren are going to need more income. Case in point, the millennials. They're struggling with home ownership. Whether it's the cloud of student debt, bad spending habits, whatever, the point is they're going to own a home much later in life than when you purchased your first home. So growth for you means future pacing for the next generation. To not grow looks something like this. You have one property and you're trying to extricate all of your dreams and goals out of one 7-unit you've had for 30 years because you've convinced yourself there's no way, no how that you can do any better. I have a handful of clients in this room that'll tell you otherwise, but this is how you approach your investment strategy. And I understand what comes with that you become comfortable over time and life happens and these type of things, but that's maybe not the best way to grow. Like a mentor of mine in the business tells me, he says, Chris, investors can choose to do one of two things. They can either grow their rental income to match their financial goals and dreams, or they can shrink their goals and dreams to fit their income. It's their choice. The third leg of the stool is to prepare for tomorrow. Depending on where you are, preparation could mean something as simple as the right estate planning to ensure that you mitigate taxes for your future heirs. For some of you in this room, you already were considering to sell and exit real estate altogether and ride off into the sunset. Maybe you thought that would be 2-3 years down the road. Now with the passage of rent control, that's the straw that breaks the camel's back, and so you take advantage of it today. For others of you, it's just a matter of continuing information so that you're not caught flat-footed with the wrong rents in place when things like rent control come to be. As we go through the course of this afternoon, and why for the last 10 years I've put this event on for investors, is so that you could identify for yourself what pillar are you in, or what pillar should you be in, and really take in the information that the panel of speakers is going to share over the course of this afternoon through that lens. Going back to 2008, when we had the first investors luncheon, the birth of the first event, again, I'm starting out, so it's much more quaint. 35, 40 investors were at the Derby in Santa Anita. And at that time, there was a woman in the room by the name of Dawn. Dawn, when I meet her in 2008, had owned her investment properties for about 20 years. Dawn, like many, had bought into the philosophy that, well, I bought my property so long ago, that means my property taxes are low, and I own them nearly free and clear, so there's no way to grow my income from here. Because if I sell an exchange, that means my property taxes will go up and I'll have a new mortgage. There's no way, no how in that scenario that you can make more money. And she had bought into that philosophy. And it wasn't even the first luncheon or the third luncheon, but the 9th luncheon that Dawn attends. for having rubbed shoulders with investors like you who are more sizable owners, and from the information that she received from this stage, something finally clicked. And not that she made the decision to sell on the spot, but in the sense that she went from no way, no how to, okay, there's enough client testimonials here to say maybe there is potential for me, because ideally I would like to get out of pillar one, just managing what I currently have, and move on to pillar two, which would be growth. Coincidentally, and I'll share with you why coincidence in a moment, was this other woman, dear Priscilla. Priscilla was at the same luncheon. Priscilla was already in pillar two. Priscilla had already gone through exchanges on her own, and very impressive, single retired woman doing this on her own. And growth for Priscilla looked different. She was managing 2 different locations. She would prefer to own 1 location, but she had split her income or her equity into 2. And the question being was, could you sell 2 locations, time the exchange so that the money could come together and you would end up with a property that not only would replace your current income, but that actually could increase your income? Can you do that when you go to 1? Well, sure, if you increase the bedroom count and you change the location. Then we have Mr. Whale. Mr. Whale, we'll call him Mr. Whale because Whale, we associate a lot of something, in this case, real estate. And when he and I began conversing in 2008, when you own as much real estate as he does, and you're very wide and you own different asset types, retail, multifamily, warehouse, he was a little grumpy, to say the least, because he had got stung in a couple places. So he was convinced that he was in pillar 3. From this point, I just stand pat, no changes whatsoever. But I call him in 2009, trying to encourage him to re-enter the market. I knew he had a lot of equity that he had available to him, given the size of his ownership. And I was sharing with him a building I had for sale, and he said, Chris, don't call me until prices go to $100,000 per unit. And we're talking about the eastern San Gabriel Valley, which at that time, let's say, was about $165,000 per unit. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, tell me you don't like me, tell me you don't have the money, but don't tell me prices are going to go from $165,000 to $100,000 per unit. Then comes 2012. Hello, Mr. Whale. Chris German. Yeah, I just listed this new building, 20 units for $2 million. I know, you're right. And it was with that he saw certain things in the market that he had been waiting for, that he buys and sells and buys and sells. And over the last 7 years has dramatically changed the financial trajectory of his portfolio. Here's the coincidence. Dawn decides to sell her 9-unit property. It fits well for Priscilla's 1031 exchange. Priscilla now buys the 9-unit. Dawn, realizing that maybe I should sell my 2 locations to have more equity for my use, sells her second property, buys an 18-unit building that Mr. Whale owned. And Mr. Whale, doing what he does, sold it and continued to buy building and building. What am I saying? Whether it's the information or the information that these investors needed from what they received from this stage, primarily from the speakers involved and the information they're going to share with you over the next couple of hours here, no matter what their investor story was, which pillar they were in, they were able to get the right information so that they made decisions based upon math, facts, rationale, and they no longer were held by the fear of change, the fear of maybe their philosophy was flawed at the time. So since 2008, now we've been doing this 10 years, the intent of the event has never changed. The intent being that by you being here with the apartment dealer and rubbing shoulders with us, that you would receive the right information given the news of the day. In 2008, everything was wrong. Today, it's rent control. And so we hope that, again, we're able to inform you and you feel more educated as we go over the course of this afternoon. So if we need to educate ourselves, what is it that we need to know? Well, as I mentioned, we first need to get a grapple on the capital markets. The stock market, how's your stock portfolio been doing the last 2 days? Not great. You have a Fed that says at the beginning of the year, we're going to hold rates, and they say, no, we're not going to hold rates, and they don't know what to do. So I said, okay, you can't bring somebody in from Wells Fargo to speak to you guys just to read a rate sheet. Any monkey could do that. but I brought in two individuals who have decades of experience in the financial markets. We have with us Gil Figueroa of First Commercial Capital, and we have Gianni Galati of Chase Commercial Lending. And between the two of them have closed hundreds of millions of dollars in commercial loans. But most importantly, they own multifamily, just like you and I. When it comes to housing, we need to have a macro view of what's going on overall within real estate. So who better than Bruce Norris? Bruce Norris, over the last 3 decades, has bought and sold over 1,000 income properties. But more important to you is the fact that he's been able to pinpoint key inflection points in the market, whether it was going to tick up or tick down. And he has a lot to say and share with us who are multifamily owners. So we have Bruce Norris of the Norris Group. We have Mr. Steven Spear. Now, he's a real estate lawyer. He's probably the one you want to question most, of course, given rent control. But we weren't going to just bring in some eviction attorney. Nothing against eviction attorneys. Unfortunately, we all need them at some point. But Steve litigates real estate law in courtrooms, representing landlords like myself and you, in jury trials, and has seen the worst of the worst. And he comes here with a vast storehouse of knowledge to share with you, here's what other investors did that was completely wrong, and here's how you can keep yourself out of trouble. And he has ownership in over 2,000 units. So he has the practical knowledge of how do you apply this stuff as a landlord, not just the textbook answer. And then last, we have the gentleman that's coming to the stage now, my friend, Mr. Stephen Hall. Steve and his family for the last 4 decades have worked with individuals from average net worth to significant net worth. And if, like they say, the rich get richer, instead of saying why, we should be saying how. Steve's going to answer that question of how. How do you mitigate taxes? How do you take advantage of the 20% deduction that Trump gave us and all the rest? And what do the markets tell us that we see right now at this present moment? So with that, please help me welcome Mr. Stephen Hall.
Good morning, everyone. How's everybody doing? Is everybody excited to learn more about taxes? Anyway, thank you, Chris, for the introduction. I'm excited to be here today in front of all of you because my favorite topic is taxation in real estate. So I'm going to jump into this here. So the goal is today is two objectives for our audience. One is to understand what this tax code means under the Trump legislation, and number 2, to talk about demographic shifts that are taking place in Los Angeles County and how that impacts you. And finally, number 3, there are 3 points, is what is Wall Street's actions and activity in the marketplace, how is that going to affect us as landlords going forward? So who am I? My name is Stephen Hall. We've been around for over 4 decades as a family tax firm in Glendale, California. We prepare tax returns from limited liability companies to property management companies to individual families, things of that nature. And we're well versed in real estate because we are ourselves landlords, so we understand in your shoes what you're dealing with as landlords. And we handle over 1,000 landlords, just to give you an idea of the size of our practice. So we see every asset class from single family homes to apartment buildings, mobile home parks, storage facilities, et cetera, et cetera. The first topic I want to talk about is LLCs and S-Corps. How many of us in this room have an LLC? If you look around, it's about 1/3 of the room. And Stephen will talk about this later on, Stephen Spear, about the importance of protecting yourself with an LLC. Because LLCs stand for Limited Liability Company. It's a vehicle that'll help minimize your liability from the tenant. And Stephen can talk about in further detail what that means to you from a legal perspective. From a tax perspective, it's a great estate planning tax tool to help spread the wealth from one generation to the next. Because how many of us are patriarchs that want to have complete control over the family portfolio? And I see a lot of smiles. in the room right now when I ask that question. An LLC is a great vehicle to where you as the managing member could have all the control, but you can gift ownership percentage of your legacy to your children without losing control. And from a tax perspective and an estate planning perspective, you'll be able to shift some of that ownership to your heirs while you're alive and help reduce the taxable value of your estate. And that's going to be important because I have some clients today that say, I don't have to worry about tax. The ceiling is $11 million per person for a total of $22 million if you're a husband and wife. So what does that mean? Is if you're married today and you have a properly executed living trust, the first 20 plus million of value is tax-free. But remember, that's under this tax administration. How often do we see presidents change the tax code? Very often. Every presidency has changed the tax code. So it's going to be important to plan ahead and plan accordingly of your estate, even though the estate plan today is very favorable to the landlord. But it may not be favorable in the future. And keep in mind, we have another election cycle coming up next fall. And the second item here is an S Corp. What is an S Corp? An S Corp is a corporation that can generate business activity and business deductions. We do not recommend S corporations to own any real estate. S corporations are great for property management activity. That's a business-related activity, but not necessarily a landlord activity where you own real estate assets. So we always recommend to have your real estate assets owned by limited liability companies and have your property management activity run by your S corporation. And we could talk about that in further detail on a one-on-one basis of whether or not it makes sense for you to have a S corporation for your property management activity. C Corps. In some cases, the taxpayer will have a C Corp instead of an S Corp. Now the question is, what is a C Corp? What does that mean? 100%, I shouldn't say 100%, 99% of publicly traded companies on Wall Street are C Corps. The question is, how does that affect me if I'm a landlord in Los Angeles? The answer is, a C Corp is a great vehicle if you have large medical expenses or insurance policies that you pay for, such as disability insurance and health insurance. A C Corp allows you to deduct 100% of your expenses and medical-related expenses. So for example, if you're a landlord and you have a spouse or a relative that has special needs and have expensive healthcare costs, it may be beneficial to you to have a C Corp so you can deduct 100% of those expenses versus potentially losing the tax benefits of deducting them under you individually. The second point, under the Trump tax code, they lower the tax rate for C Corps from as high as 35% down to 21%. So that helps all of us if you want to retain money at the company level. And depending upon your circumstance, it may make sense to do such a strategy. So let's talk about pass-through. Chris mentioned earlier, there's a new 20% deduction for landlords. What Chris was referring to my left, you'll see that if you have a pass-through company such as an LLC, and in this case for landlords, it could be under you individually as well, as long as you actively manage your real estate activity more than 250 hours a year, you qualify for a 20% deduction on profits that go to you individually at the federal tax level. Now the key is to document your time. How many of us keep a diary of your activity every week? If you look around, not very many hands. It's the way you can win your argument in an audit if you want to take advantage of the 20% tax-free deduction to you as a landlord is to keep a diary of your activity every week. So simply, for a half hour a week, take notes of what your activity was because we want to make sure you pass that 250-hour threshold so you could deduct off the top 20% of your profits as a landlord. And as discussed, the official name is called qualified business income, which basically means since you're a landlord and you spend over 250 hours in the area of real estate as a landlord and you have a profit from the business, you get to save 20% on the income. And let's talk about some limitations. If you're a landlord, you do not apply as a landlord for a rental property the $750,000 limit. If you're buying a new home today, Congress has passed a law where the largest loan you'll be able to deduct is $750,000 worth of mortgage balance on the interest you pay on the loan. So if your loan is $1 million and your total interest is let's call it $100,000 a year, Congress will only allow you to deduct $75,000 up to $100,000 worth of interest because it's 75% of the total $1 million loan balance. And that's an important point for all of us in this room. Based on this law, has Congress incentivized home ownership in LA County? No. There's one more point to talk about. There's now a cap on state and local taxes. The cap is $10,000 total. How many of us pay more than $10,000 a year in property tax on our own primary residence? A lot of us do, especially the millennials and the young folks that want to buy a home. So now, if you work and you want to buy a home, the combined deduction between your property tax for your home and the property tax that you pay on your home and the tax withholding you pay to the state of California, if you pay greater than $10,000 between the tax you pay to the state of California and your property tax, you are now capped at $10,000. Is that a favorable legislative action by Congress for homeowners in LA County? No. But is that going to help shift the mindset of young couples to continue to rent in LA County as a result of those tax laws? The answer is yes. And that's going to be helpful for you as a landlord when you see what's going to happen. To give you a case in point, last night I spoke to two of my clients. They're both C-level executives with Goldman Sachs. And they forecast the millennials, only 2% of the millennials are going to buy in LA County. But the rest of them will continue to rent because the tax incentives of homeownership is dwindling. So that's going to help all of you in the room. When Chris talked about raising rents, it's an important topic to review in your household to see what kind of rents you should be charging based on the pent-up demand that's coming from our millennial generation. So let's talk about tax brackets. As a result of these activities, the standard deduction for a married couple went from, let's say, $15,000 up to $24,000. But if you look at a home, a $700,000 mortgage, the average interest you pay on a $700,000 mortgage is, let's say, $20,000. But if the standard deduction is $24,000, that family won't see much of a difference if they own a home. So as you can see, the government is giving more and more adoption towards the renter community than the homeowner community. But to the landlord, they're giving you a 20% pass-through savings if you're a landlord on profits. So you see now how the tax legislation is dividing the country between the landlord and the homeowners that buy their homes. You're going to see a big gap in home ownership as a result of this legislation. And currently, with the Trump administration, they are eliminating the Obamacare penalty if you do not have health insurance. But here's what's interesting I'm finding with my clients. How many of us realize that they're spending more in healthcare insurance and healthcare costs than taxes all put together? If you look around the room, you're going to see that more and more. And that's why it's important to look at your personal situation to see if a C Corp may make sense to take advantage of the C Corp to deduct your healthcare costs. Another piece of legislation that took place is called Opportunity Zone funds. Opportunity zones exist all over the United States. So if you miss your 1031 exchange timeline to identify a property in 45 days and your 180-day window to close, there is a remedy to the problem. And that remedy is called investing in an opportunity zone. So here are the rules. If you have a capital gain event, you have a deadline on December 31 to to maximize your benefits. And so if you see here, number 2, you have to find an opportunity zone to invest in. And as long as you invest in that zone within 180 days, you could potentially pay no tax. And that's correct, no tax, because on year 2029, there's a permanent exclusion on paying any taxes on the gain, even if you cash out. But the key is you have to invest in that opportunity zone by 12/31 of 2019 to qualify. And the key is on number 3, you have to invest in a project that is building something ground up. So if you were to build a home ground up and rent it out, or if you were to build a fourplex ground up and hold the asset for 10 years, you'll qualify. But here are the rules. If you liquidate the asset by year 5, if you look at point number 4 in 2024, the government will exempt 10% of your tax. And if you wait till year 7, the government will give you a savings of 5% of the tax. But if you hold it 10 years, there's no tax whatsoever. So the bottom line is, if you plan on reinvesting somewhere and you missed your 1031 exchange timeline, an opportunity zone may make sense, but there's a catch. California does not recognize this rule. So California will still want to collect 13% from you. So I know I've covered a lot of ground in the short time I have today, but the last piece I want to show all of you talks about what just happened the last 10 days. And that will change what has taken place the last decade. And this is a significant event. And I'm going to play this video in a second that will explain what the Federal Reserve did to the mortgage markets last week and what they're going to continue to do. The Federal Reserve last week, through their actions, have admitted that there's very little liquidity in the marketplace and that they need to increase their capital expenditure to keep the mortgage markets moving forward, as well as the money markets. So I'm going to play this quick video that talks about what the economy is doing and how fragile it is.
The Fed pumps another $110 billion into the markets as investor demand surges. Take a look at this here. We can see the data directly from the Federal Reserve's own website. I'll show you that in just a moment. Wanted to point out something here. The bank offered $50 billion in repos expiring overnight and $60 billion in repos expiring in 14 days. Banks bid for more than was available on each repo, signaling strong demand for the government-backed asset. The central bank doubled the maximum size of the operation after an offering earlier this week was oversubscribed, meaning banks placed more bids for repos than the Fed was selling. Despite the fact that the limitation is already very large, it's going beyond that. And we have seen this time and time again. This tells you right now that there is a scramble going on and the Federal Reserve is trying its best to keep up with it all. At the same time, when we had Jerome Powell at his speech talking about how this is all very temporary, he needs to start backtracking on that and telling the public that it is simply a matter of time before this all gets fixed up. But there's other issues here that we'll discuss in just a moment. I wanted to show you the New York Fed's website where you can see this information for yourself. Repo and reverse repo operations link will be in the description as always. You can see all of this for yourself on here. If you scroll down, it goes through each day, and I will zoom in just for a moment here to give you an idea. So tomorrow morning, you're going to see this information updated with the numbers as to what happens exactly. Then you could scroll down and take a look at this, showing you the different dates. Pay attention to the maturity date on there, whereas in this case here, you're seeing Friday, September 27th. If you scroll down even further, you're going to see the maturity on this one is October 10th. So just don't get confused if you're looking at this and it's off in chronological order. This is the reason why. What's important to note is that when all of this is going on, we are also seeing the total assets held by the Federal Reserve increasing. Take a look at this. I've been tracking it for you, and over the past few weeks, this has gone up. This is not normal because if you see what has happened over the last little while, obviously it had been going down as the Federal Reserve started to wind down its balance sheet, this whole quantitative tightening that never really happened. But of course, here we are a few weeks into it, and this has been increasing. increasing. Whether or not they are going to do QE through the back door or it's going to be right in front of your face, you know that there is only a matter of time in between now and that moment where they come out to the public and simply tell everyone what's going to happen. QE4 is inevitable. The Fed will need to grow its balance sheet permanently. That is according to Morgan Stanley. Of course, we all know this, but this is what Morgan Stanley has to say. Let's take a look. The Federal Reserve will have to maintain permanent operations in its efforts to stabilize short-term lending markets to keep its target borrowing rate in check. And if they're going to bring down the interest rates even further, I do believe that they're going to encounter even more problems. The result is projected to be a $315 billion balance sheet expansion over the next 6 months. Morgan Stanley sees the Fed buying a combination of short-term treasury bills and notes across the duration spectrum. Of course, I will track it all. I will bring it to you in future videos. A lot of people have asked me for an explanation. What is this? I don't get it. It's going over my head. I had covered it in a previous video. Let me just read this to you extremely quickly. Market repurchase agreements are a type of short-term loan often used by the Fed to regulate the nation's money supply. They resemble government bonds as they're secure, feature steady interest rates, and have set maturation dates or terms. When enacting a repo operation, the U.S. Central Bank sells government securities to banks with predetermined repurchase dates. The offerings come with set interest rates, which create capital over the short-term borrowing period, which was previously not part of the country's economy. The Money GPS translation is basically that the Federal Reserve goes in, intervening in this market, trying to keep the interest rates within the range that they have set. When the interest rate is too low or perhaps even too high, but we don't have to worry about that anytime soon, it is more difficult for them to keep it within this level. As a result, there is more intervention required. If the free market was setting interest rates, of course we wouldn't have any of this, but that's a whole different video. The interest rates associated with repos are relatively low, and most repos are repurchased the day after they are sold. However, several multi-billion-dollar repo offerings can add up to a sizable injection of capital into the US economy, and of course that's what's happening right now.
Now, the good news is, despite all this activity that I mentioned, the way the tax code has been written, it is favoring the landlord. And the tenant base is going to get ever more sophisticated. 10 years ago, the tenant base today would be buying a home. Today, that tenant base is not incentivized to buy a home. So therefore, you're going to see working professionals renting versus owning a home. So you're going to see a different market of tenants in your buildings as a result of the incentives of the tax code, which is going to help the landlord get better quality tenants as well as additional tax savings on in your portfolio. So, do we have any questions? And what should you do? Everybody in this room has a different situation in their life between what they want to do with their family and how they want to leave their legacy for their children, or their immediate healthcare situation, what they have as far as healthcare costs and what it costs to run the cost of premium and medical expenses. So everybody in this room is going to have a unique situation. So if you have any questions, we at Robert Hall & Associates can help you with your tax preparation, your tax planning, as well as talking about your structuring of a C Corp or an LLC to see, or an S Corp to see what makes sense. So as a result, we have a complimentary 30-minute consultation where you can simply complete the postcard that is on your table, and we'll be more than happy to review your questions in our office, or you can simply text us with the code here, 38470, and we'll be more than happy to review your individual situation and create an individual tax plan that fits to your portfolio. And with that, I'd like to thank Chris for putting together such a great luncheon, and we'll talk soon through our Q&A panel. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hall. The note cards that Mr. Hall was talking about are these ones that you see on your table. If you see on the back side, there's enough space to write down all your questions. And the other side is a survey. Now, I know Chris, I've been working with him for a while now. The note cards that are most filled out are probably going to be the ones that are answered first, just a heads up. At any rate, my name is Deepan Shah. I'm a part of the Apartment Dealer Multifamily team. We're going to be switching gears now. Up next is the capital markets. Who here agrees that in the past year, it's been a roller coaster ride with respect to the Fed, the interest rates, the economy? Just me? Okay, I guess you guys know it all. At the beginning of the year, the Fed came out and said that they will not be raising interest rates or lowering them because what they see in the economy is that everything's great. Just this past month, not only did they lower the interest rates, but they said that they will continue to do so if they see fit. On top of that, they added quantitative easing. That's terminology that we have not heard since 2008. So to discuss all this on top of rent control, how will, if you go to purchase, if you go to refinance, if you go to grow your portfolio, how will the banks be looking at rent control now differently when they lend you money? So to discuss all this, we have Gil Figueroa. Gil Figueroa is the CEO of First Commercial Capital. He's been a commercial lender for the past 25 years now. And because he's a commercial lender, his touch and feel is across the board of what he sees on the market. So with that, please help me welcome Mr. Gil Figueroa.
Thank you, Deepan. Good morning. How's everyone? Good morning. How's everyone? All right. So Chris mentioned something interesting in the beginning. He said that in 2008, he sold properties at $100 a door. Well, what is that same property worth today? 2.5 times more? How many of you, show of hands, planned and knew that was going to happen? No. So how many of you feel very lucky that it happened? Okay. We're going to talk about luck, and we're going to talk about, a little later, we're going to circle back to luck. So I'll tell you a little bit about my firm. We've been a mortgage broker for 25 years. I love being a mortgage broker because lenders have different appetites. And every time a lender changes their appetite, we're on the cutting edge and we find the best lender for your situation at any given time. So currently we're working with a lot of lenders that are pricing larger loans much more aggressively than anyone else. Right now we have rates as low as 3.47 on a 10-year fix. So that's an aggressive product. They're looking for good product and a good client. The beauty of sourcing loans is we know every lender's underwriting criteria, what they're looking for, and how it can benefit you. So currently we all know about the rent control challenges, and now we're dealing with that. Has it affected lenders? Absolutely has affected lenders. So the larger lenders, for instance, the Chase, Wells Fargo, US Bank, are doing retro underwriting. Now, what does that mean? If you bring them a file today and the rents were raised after March, after March, they're going to go retro to before March to underwrite that file. What that means to you is they're going to be very, very conservative on pricing and loan amount. So in essence, what they've done is lowered their debt service, okay? Us, on the other hand, we have lenders that are more aggressive and are looking at this in a little more common sense approach, especially if the rents weren't raised. They're looking to underwrite based on forecasted rents within the allotted maximum of 5 to 7%. So in essence, we have lenders that are still aggressive in this marketplace. Some of the bigger guys have stepped down or being a little more conservative. Okay. In October of 18, in the similar event, I called for rates to drop. At that time, no one thought rates would drop, especially one certain junior guy, Jamie Dimon, said rates were going to go up to 5% yield on a treasury. Now, that's a big statement. A 5% yield is a 7% rate. So that's a huge increase. So Dimon warned of the probability of significant rate increases. However, during October, I predicted they'd go down. And the next chart shows why my prediction. So we see at the high of the chart is when rates are the lowest. And the low of the chart is when the rates are the highest. So if you notice all the way to the right, the chart hit a bottom, the projected market top, and the treasury yields were as high as 323. The market did a triple bottom or double top right at that position and couldn't break that threshold, couldn't break it, and reverse position. They reversed all the way back up to the top. Okay, so you see on the second projected market low of the treasury recently was 143. Okay, that hit somewhere around September. So we hit an all-time low. At that particular time, we sent out a lock criteria. We asked all our buyers, you need to lock, we want you to lock. Matter of fact, I believe there's 2 or 3 in here that took advantage of the lock, and we locked at 3.40, and within a week of our timing, the rates had jumped to 3.75. So we forecasted that market as well. Okay. What's next? On August 16th, Chris asked me to do a little webinar. And in our webinar, we discussed the market conditions and where we're at. At that time, I saw that we hit a top, and I felt rates were going to do a reverse, an increase. Not a giant increase, but an increase. We were right again. That market moved from a 3.4 rate on a 5-year multifamily building to 3.75, and some lenders as high as 4%. So, where are we now? If you notice on the chart to your right, we bounced up, we bounced down, which means rates went up. And now recently in the last 2 days, we bounced up again, which means rates are down again. Now we didn't break a threshold. So based on what I'm seeing in the market, my advice is to lock right now. Okay. So even though you're hearing the market tell you rates are going to 0, the chart is not telling us that. The chart is telling us there's tremendous resistance at that level, and we keep bouncing from that top. So the chart is telling us that rates are going to blip up. How high? We don't know yet. So there's certain thresholds that we look at. So if we get to a certain yield, which I think is about 275 on the 10-year treasury, and we break, we could be headed for much higher rates. So this is the time to lock your rates. All right, state of the market. So January, the Fed's position was they were happy with the current economic growth, inflation, unemployment. They said they weren't going to, they wouldn't lower rates, and they might not raise them. Okay? At that time, there was no talk of Fed easing. As a matter of fact, they, until that time, were stopping quantitative easing and discussing lowering the debt on the books. So that was the objective. Well, what just happened? The Feds did an about-face, a complete 180-degree turn. They turned completely different. On September 16th, they lower rates by a quarter. Now, the part that's mysterious is that at the same time, we had the repo market that Steve was mentioning come up short. Now, it didn't just come up short a little bit. This is interbank lending between banks on a short-term loan. Usually, these loans are one night. So the repo rate was trading between 2 and 2.5% on the internight trade. The bidders were not existent. The bids went all the way up to 10%, and no one bidded. It was mysteriously shut down, and a mysterious buyer came in and bought at 2.5. We know who that buyer is. It's the Fed. Now think about that. These banks were offered a 500% return for 1 day, greater than the 2% they were being offered, yet no one took it. Now, why wouldn't they take that? It sounds like a liquidity issue in my book. So we're dealing with a big problem. The question is, when does this problem bubble up and explode? We don't know. So Japan had it is continually having for 10 years. They just keep adding liquidity. On our part, we're adding it. As a matter of fact, by October 10th, which is when the Fed say they will stop this liquidity, they've borrowed $1 trillion into our system. The last time this happened, as Steve mentioned, was 2008 during Lehman Brothers, when Lehman Brothers was insolvent and pushed to declare bankruptcy. So, folks, whether we Know it or not, we are in Q4. Maybe they're not calling it that yet, but we are most definitely in Q4. Okay, what does this mean? Well, we talked about that. Decade long in Japan, still moving forward. Japan is still moving forward somehow. Some would say they're just treading water. Not much growth, no GDP growth. Where are we at on market rates? If markets cannot bid because of lack of liquidity, can rates go down? Let's talk about that. I say that's an impossibility. If there's no funds to buy bonds, rates cannot come down. Matter of fact, bonds will be liquidated. So there's many speaking of a bond bubble. The interesting part of our system right now is we're dealing with many bubbles, not just a bond bubble. So right now, we are in a situation where, frankly, it's above my pay grade to explain of what to do or what not to do, per se. But when we're in these situations, I always look for one main indicator. And the one main indicator I look for is, what are the big boys doing right now? What are they doing? Well, Mr. Buffett has $122 billion in cash, the most he's ever held. Now, do you think he buys bottoms and sells tops? I would say so. I say he's good at it. Other rich are hoarding cash as well. So with the political, geopolitical, trade, economic credit risk, everyone is getting liquidated. So what are you doing these days with your portfolio? What are you looking at? Most apartment owners that I meet with have very little liquidity. They have $20 million net worth and they have $50,000 in the bank. And I'm like, you can't run like this. You can't run this operation. If there's a shortfall, you're going to have a huge problem. So Buffett said it best once. He says, you don't know how everyone's dressed until the water resides. Then you'll see who's swimming naked. So I believe that's the truth. With that being said, what do we do? I believe we need to have an investment game plan, unlike ever before, okay? So in the beginning, I asked, how many of you felt lucky? Everyone did. How many believe that luck will prevail in the future without a plan? So lucky's over. It's time to plan. Chris has amassed the top guys in the field here, whether it be in mortgage, law, forecasting, and tax implications. Use us. Be ready. Get a game plan. Every asset you have should have a specific game plan. How long will you own this asset? How will you pass it through to your heirs? Every plan. Do you leave the state? Do you buy in a different state? Do you exchange? Do you liquidate? Do you do cash out refi? Do you get strong? What's the old motto? Buy when there's blood on the streets. That's always worked. If you have the liquidity, you can buy. If you don't have the liquidity, you become the blood. So, with that being said, I believe there has to be a specific game plan. There's a lot of issues moving forward. We have talk of Prop 13 being changed. We have volatile interest rates. The market's going to be moving quickly. And we have drastic changes in lending. Like I said before, the lenders are changing. Some of the larger lenders are becoming more conservative. Chase, for instance, had a 115 debt service. They dropped it to 120. So now, raised it to 120. So they're lending less. Okay? So they're being a little more conservative. So with all these changes and a potential black swan event, which is liquidity, we need to be prepared. With that being said, Chris has amassed the best team. Take advantage of us, set an appointment, sit down. Let's analyze each and every asset in your game plan. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Gil. That was insightful. Up next, we have a gentleman by the name of Bruce Norris. Many of you are already familiar with Bruce's work, but for those of you that aren't, Mr. Norris has tracked this real estate market to the T for the past 3 decades. Initially, it started off for his personal investments, and over the years, now it's become to educate the masses. We realize that there are many forecasters out there that say, this is what you should do, when to do it, how to do it. But Mr. Norris likes to take a different approach. He likes to show you the facts, the information, present you with all of that so that you, the investor, can make an educated decision by yourself without anyone having to force their opinion on you. So with that, please help me welcome Mr. Bruce Norris.
Thank you for having me back. How many of you are hearing me speak for the first time? Just curious. Wow. In 2006, we wrote a report called the California Crash, predicting real estate prices would go down by about half. Did that seem a little crazy at the time? 2006, we were off to the races. And here's a nut writing a report that things were going to get very bad. The only way I can do that is if I don't get emotionally attached to what's going on and look at what's likely going to come. And that's what we do. We take a look at charts and say, this is a likely outcome. I'm going to take you through a series of purchases that I made. And I want you to understand what event occurred to create the opportunity. And I'm going to start today with asking you a question. What do you consider the most important word in real estate investing? You all have your own answer. I'm going to give you mine as we go through today. The first example was this Grand Junction fourplex. In 1982, they sold for $200,000. There was something going on in the Grand Junction area called oil shale. It exploded. And they built all of these fourplexes. And then about 3 years later, oil shale disappeared. And these fourplexes were no longer selling for $200,000. I got introduced to the market when they were selling for $110,000 and then $90,000. And I made a bulk offer for all of the HUD fourplexes for $40,000. HUD said no, they laughed, and 9 months later they accepted that $40,000 offer. I was pretty young at the time, and I don't know if you've ever had this aha moment, but I was sitting there when it was time to sign all the documents, and there was a stack of documents as I was seated that was taller than my head. And I realized I was the only one in the country that wanted this inventory. That'll give you a moment for pause. I'm buying fourplexes that are 4 years old for $40,000, and there was no competition because I never had to change my offer $1 over the months of negotiation. So what occurred there was a systemic event. I pay attention to systemic events because it's made me wealthy. In Palm Springs, in 1988, gosh, what a happy place, huh? 1988, market was crazy. And you know, sometimes investing, you invest by observing something that's in front of you that maybe other people don't recognize. So in 1988, I was going through this area in Palm Springs that were full of golf courses and custom home lots. And there were 50 lots all in this great area, and there was a building boom going on, and yet not one of those lots was being built on. And after 4 months of driving through that, it dawned on me, I bet one guy owns them all. And so I called up the Bass brothers, who happened to be on the title for all 50 lots. And I called them up, and we made a deal. And we bought those lots for $2 million. I got him to carry paper for $2 million, no down, no payments. And at the end of 6 months, I paid him off, and I made $1 million on that transaction. I'm not telling you the story to brag on that transaction. It's the next one that I learned the lesson. 1 year later, I decided to build 7 custom homes in 1989, get done with them in June of 1990, run a full-page ad for people to buy my homes, and not one phone call. That $1 million that I made over there, I donated it to this project to get out of it over 2.5 years. Now what happened? There were systemic events that went on that were outside of our world even. Japan's stock market and real estate market crashed. Well, they were a lot of the buyers that were in Palm Springs. The Cold War ended, and so forth. There was a lot of things that occurred that affected my real estate called a systemic event. And so I'm a big fan of paying attention to systemic events. Rosamond There you go. This sign has always cracked me up. Welcome to Rosamond, gateway to progress. Well, please start by painting your sign once every decade or so. So, as you can tell, Rosamond's sort of not in the middle. It's not in the main population. It's 9 miles outside of Lancaster. And Lancaster is pretty much in the middle of nowhere, but Rosamond is 9 miles after nowhere. I got a phone call one day, and I had a chance to buy 93 building lots for $270,000. It came from a source I trusted about building lots. So I drove out there, and when I got on the lots, there were single-loaded streets with the streets already in place, sewers, everything, street lights, $3,000 a piece for a finished lot. I called him up, I said, put it in escrow. It's the single best deal I've ever seen in my life. We built on those lots and made millions of dollars 4 years later. Why did I get that opportunity? Because somebody in 1989 developed those lots exactly the wrong time. And they literally sat there for 13 years. The bank that lent $3 million for that project went under. They sold the $3 million note for $100,000. The guy that sold me the lot made $170,000 selling his $100,000 purchase to me. And I bought finished building lots in California in 2003 for $3,000 a piece. I like when systemic events occur. This is an individual house, and it's going to go through 3 numbers in pretty short order. In 2006, this home went for $365,000. 3 years later, in 2009, it went for $65,000. Just missing 1 digit. And in 2018, it sold for $275,000. I was the buyer in the middle. Now, isn't it interesting? So if you think location is the key to the most important thing, here we have the same location, the same size house, and it changed value, went down by 80%, went up by 300%. How do you figure out how to get in the middle of that? Is you kind of pay attention to systemic events. And there's an interesting thing about market value. So we've had 3 values, 365, 65, 280-ish, okay. So what's the definition of market value? Definition of market value is the likely price that will emerge when a buyer and seller, equally knowledgeable and motivated, come to an agreement. That's basically it. And then there's one other phrase that's attached to it. And it says that the transaction is absent undue stimulus. Transactional stimulus, what would that be? Chris, on his sheet of available properties, had a 6-plex in Banning that was for sale, I think, for $680,000. Well, what if the seller called up Chris and said, you know what, let's do something special on this $680,000. Let me carry the paper at 0 interest rate for 30 years. Every payment will be a principal reduction, no interest rate. What would happen to the price of that 6-plex? Would that go up? It should go up. That's called transactional stimulus. As an appraiser, I should go out there and I see this comp that went for $800 for a 6-plex, go, well, what's the deal? Oh, no interest loan. As an appraiser, I can reduce that comp because that was an inducement that was only attached to that particular sale. Well, what's interesting about this house, it didn't have, see this first comp, $365,000 comp. Was there transactional stimulus in 2006? We didn't need it. We had systemic stimulus. And what was the stimulus? You didn't need to qualify for a loan. They were giving them away like candy. And how I know that is I hadn't borrowed money for years, and I saw the prices completely getting out of whack. And I interviewed a lender in front of an audience this size in 2007 or 8. And I said, stated income loans. I said, where do you get the stated income number? And without batting an eye, she said, oh, we just make it up. That's systemic stimulus. That's how you get a house in Moreno Valley to get to 365. Because of that mistake, it turned into something around 65. Now, once again, I'm in escrow at $65,000. Why would that be? Because they didn't have an offer at 66. And all of a sudden, I got that same feeling that I did in Grand Junction. It seems like a good idea. This thing rents for $1,400. I'm buying it for $65,000. If you get a permit and buy a lot in Moreno Valley, you'll be in it over $65,000. So you think that's probably a good idea. How come I don't have any company? And that's the truth about what happens when there's a systemic event. It gets scary. And you'll be amazed at how little company you have buying into the teeth of a dangerous time. Because if people are making emotional decisions, it's scary stuff. If you look at a chart and you go, oh my gosh, this is the time of our life, then you can buy with both hands and you will not have a lot of company. It's also hard to sell when everybody's euphoric. I debated some of the smartest people in the country in front of audiences. One of those audiences in 2006 was the California Builders Association. How would you like to be the person that tells the builders in 2006, you should sell every lot, every land project, every house you have and get the heck out of here? When at the time, everything they built had multiple offers and 5 people in line waiting to buy whatever they were building. But what was the right decision? They should get out of there. But that's really hard for them because they are experiencing a euphoric moment every day. Now, what's interesting, one of the reasons that we have, when we've studied cycles, we try to figure out what charts are most important. So this is an important chart. This is the number of trustee sales, the end of the foreclosure process that's occurred over a long period of time, with very different results. So at the beginning, and look at the 80s, we have this foreclosure increase. The percentage is almost 1,000% up from a bottom. Take a look at the years that occurs. What were interest rates during that cycle? I borrowed money to become a full-time investor in 1981 at 17.5% fixed. We had over 10% unemployment. We had 1,000% increase in foreclosures. What happened to real estate prices between 80 and 85 when all that was going on? Did they crash? If I gave you that set of charts as a background, wouldn't you think prices would crash? And they did not. And that's a head scratcher. You can have all that go on and no price damage. That's a shock. If we go to the next one, we have more foreclosures. We had a higher starting point. We had 1,000% increase in trustee sales in the 90s. We had an interest rate that wasn't 17.5%, it was 10. We had an unemployment rate that was 7.5, not 10. So we had better statistics. And if you were involved in the 90s, we had a gradual price decline of something like 22% over a 6-year period with better charts. Well, what happened was the mix of foreclosures got worse in the 90s than it was in the 80s. And so if you were in the 80s, the mix was 1 in 4 sales was an REO. They didn't have short sales back then. They didn't know what that was. So if you're an appraiser and you're appraising in 1982 and only 1 in 4 comps is a lender-owned property that's on sale and discounted, can you ignore that? You can. That's not the market. In the 90s, it was 4 out of 10. Now it's closing in on half of the evidence of what something is worth. Does that start impacting value? Yes, it does. Now there's another chart that goes a little crazy, and at that peak, it represented 80% of the sales in California. 8 in 10 comps. So here was my dilemma when I bought that house in Moreno Valley at 65 grand. And trust me, I'm going to back this into your apartment world in just a second. So I bought this house at $65,000. We fixed it with 20. We put it up for sale and we had 25 offers in 2 days for full price. The appraisal came in at 95. 24 people raised their hand and said it's the best property on the market and we'll pay what you're asking. And the appraisal came in 30 grand light. Because why? Because I was the only fixed up house, period. Everything else was available, didn't have a kitchen. And the way the rules were at the time, if the appraiser had come in at the number that everybody said we'll buy one at, and by the way, we actually interviewed the president of the the Appraisal Institute on a radio show, a guy named Magzi Aries, and he said to me, each one of those offers was legitimate comps. The problem with the world at that point is the appraiser, if he'd come in at 125, would there have been a review appraiser? Absolutely. And if he came in at 95, that appraiser that came at 125 would never have gotten another appraisal assignment from that lender. That's why I look for systemic events, because it creates tremendous opportunity if you can get over the fear and know you're making the right decision. Now, what's interesting about this trustee sale chart, it has something to do with the apartments. This flood of renters that you got didn't migrate here. They owned a house in Moreno Valley, and they didn't make their payment. And they didn't get kicked out for 3 years. And then after they got kicked out for 7 years, they couldn't qualify for a home loan. For the last decade, 10% of the owners of California became renters in your places. That's a systemic event. That was hugely beneficial. Those people didn't have to migrate here. They were here. And you got them as renters until about now. Now, what's really interesting is interest rates. By the way, Chris, the reason I'm here is because I really respect this guy. I really do. I would do business with him. I don't buy apartment. If I did, I would deal with him. He's an honorable guy. The other big benefit of being here is I get to sit in the back table and bat it around with some really smart people, which is really fun. So interest rates are very interesting right now. So my take on it is a little different. Right now we have a 1.6% 10-year T-bill, which is a little bit astonishing because if I look at the employment chart, where are we? It's called full employment, 4%. Well, what are we doing at 1.6 with a full employment chart? In 1932, we had the Great Recession. We had 25% unemployment. We had minus 16% GDP. You know what the 10-year T-bill was? 3.2. So this is a little bit strange, and it makes you scratch your head. I get an email from a guy I respect a lot, John Burns. He's one of the main consultants for the hedge funds and the national builders. He texts me, he says, I'm just curious, on the free and clear real estate that you have, would you borrow money if you could get negative rates? Okay, I had never heard that one before. So I thought, are you pulling my leg? Because he's not the kind that pulls legs. So I decided I would actually do a little research, and I found out if you're in Denmark, you know what the 10-year, if you borrow on a 10-year real estate loan, the rate is minus 0.5. What? Now, one of the reasons that we have a 10-year T-bill at 1.6 today, or that's actually a little bit lower, I guess, is that there's a lot of countries that have negative rates already, and a lot of that money is coming over here and buying our rates. My guess would be, and a couple years ago we wrote a report called 2% mortgage rates, 40 trillion in debt, is my guess is that we're going to have a chance to borrow real estate money at 2% and change for an owner-occupied loan. So here's the systemic event for you. You had the greatest pile of people show up to your to be your renter, and enough time has elapsed for them to have a credit score repair, and they're about to get a interest rate that starts with a 2. You have a couple of other systemic things to consider. There's people of wealth that are in the crosshairs. What's interesting, it was interesting, I got an email about the rent control legislation. And I kind of tongue-in-cheek said, you know, I don't recall voting on that. But I do recall voting on rent control. That happened the year before. And collectively, what did we say? We said no. Did it matter? I guess not. Now that's scary stuff. That is scary stuff. Prop 13 is up for grabs next year, right? But it's only part of the stuff. It's the part of the stuff that very few own. How many people own apartment buildings and commercial real estate and industrial buildings? What percentage? That's going to pass. You guys own what's in the crosshairs of a systemic cycle. And they haven't got what they want. This is just the tip of the iceberg of what they want. Don't they want Prop 13 to be changed, period? It's just the first domino. Are they done with rent control? No. And is the Fed now looking at a national program for rent control? Yes. So I would just consider, and here's the second question I was going to ask you today. How many of you would buy your own apartment building at today's valuation? Can I see a raise of hands? I want you to look around. There's not one hand. That's the definition of a real estate bubble. Now, doesn't mean you don't have to run out and sell. I'm not trying to instill fear. I'm not even trying to get Chris listings. I'm really not. I want you to realize why you're there. You were there because systemic events pushed people into your units that have never been there before. And now you have a reversal of that. So my encouragement would be, if you were going to make a decision, let's say you have, how many apartment buildings I've seen are located in lousy areas that have gone up in value. I'm a bargain hunter. One of the pieces of inventory that gets devastated in bad times is a fourplex, because you can't control the environment of all the fourplexes. You could be the perfect manager, and in Moreno Valley, you would be next to 3 vacant fourplexes with drug deals going on in the front of it. And the next time you had a vacancy, there was nobody that was going to rent it because they were scared. And so you would have vacancies. We were buying Moreno Valley fourplexes were going for 40 grand, just like the ones in Grand Junction, Colorado. And then they went up to 500, and then they went back down to 100. Because, again, vacancies continue. So at any rate, I accidentally figured out something, and this is one of the ways you can tell migration. I'd like to know where people are going. You price a U-Haul, and you price it both ways. So if you look at all the way to the right, we have September in 2019, and we'll take Phoenix. If you go from Anaheim to Phoenix, it's $969. And if you go to Anaheim from Phoenix, it's $94. $969 and $94. Now that's about the same distance, right? Why the difference? There are so many trucks leaving from Anaheim to Phoenix that the only way to have trucks in Anaheim is to have a driver that works for the company fill the tank and drive it back. That's how you tell migration trends. So wherever you own your apartment building, play that game and see if you're getting people migrating there or not. If you get an interest rate that's very affordable, there's a very good chance that people will either try to get to own something in California, or they'll migrate somewhere where they can. Florida is an interesting place. We build new homes there that are worth about $230. If you plug in a mortgage rate at 2 3/4% to that, it's hilarious what the payment is. So that's why California has a little bit of a migration problem. So here's a chart of how many people, again, about 10% of California real estate went from owner to renter. 10% of the households. And there's our 10-year T-bill. Very interesting stuff. We live in very interesting times. So we have, what is it called? Inversion of a yield curve. Now, typically, though, when we have it, we have room to go down 4 or 5 percentage points. The Fed doesn't have that room right now. So we're either going to see negative rates, or we're going to have one heck of a quantitative easing program. I am out of time, and I've enjoyed it very much, and we'll be up here to field questions later. So thank you very much.
Up next, it is my pleasure to introduce the man that has made this afternoon a possibility for the past 11 years. Chris and I have had the pleasure of working together for the past 4 years now, and I can honestly say it's bared many, many fruits. Many of you investors in this room actually know Chris longer than I have, and you continuing to be here, continuing to rub shoulders with him, shows that he's not just any apartment broker, but rather he provides value and empowers the investor so that you can change the trajectory of your financial legacy. His intent to not only bring together this powerful panel of speakers, but to also spend months invested into this event, trust me, I know, I was there, is to ensure that you receive the proper information so that you not only protect the wealth that you've created, but that you can be ready for whatever the market throws at you. Chris and I have been in over 100 multifamily meetings together with investors like yourself, and we can confidently say that there's 3 main reasons as to why an investor does not grow. Number 1, they lack information. Number 2, they fear change. And number 3, they are uncertain about the decision that they are making. That's exactly why we host this event every year, is to provide certainty in an uncertain market so that you, the investor, can reach your investment goals at a faster pace. Chris has been the recipient of every award that RE/MAX has to offer. The Lifetime Achievement Award, the CoStar Power Broker Award, the Diamond Club Award. He has sold over 250 multifamily properties and consistently ranks number 3 in the nation, in the entire United States, for the brand of RE/MAX. But what impresses me most is the philosophy by which he drives our team. If you help enough other people get what they want, you will get what you want. So with that, please help me welcome the apartment dealer, Mr. Chris German.
Okay, so now I get to take off my host hat, put on my realtor hat, so let's talk some apartments. Now, you would hope that after selling now over 250 apartment multifamily properties, that I would have been able to identify some patterns among those that, quote unquote, are the ultra successful. You can't say failure anymore because that's not politically correct. I guess it would be those who chose not to win. But we're going to talk about those that win within multifamily. Now, as I alluded to this morning, early on in my career, I came to the understanding that we weren't just helping clients buy and sell apartments, but rather we were helping them build their financial legacy. So I start sharing the next few minutes with you with the thought that there's probably somebody in this room who is just starting out. You're more in pillar 1, just trying to grapple with what you currently own. Maybe you have to do certain improvements to the current property or properties you own before you can consider growth and what have you. I mean, I've seen, again, after all these properties, it's the worst of the worst. I mean, how many of you have ever got the termite report that says, don't do it? Do you know why it says don't do it? Because if you kill the termites, the only thing holding the building together is the termites holding hands. And if you take them out, building collapses, right? So maybe some of us are somewhat there where we have to grapple with what we currently own. And with that in mind, speaking to that investor base and the rest of us to give us a general sense of where the market is. So overall sales volume. Let's understand macro what's going on within the market. Well, it only takes one look at the charts to come to the understanding that no matter what corridor you're in, sales volume has come down since 2017. And since 2017, from this stage, you would have known that the market has been trailing sideways. Now, have there been some outlier sales that continue to push prices? Well, sure. Last year, or the beginning of this year, I should say, my partner Deepan and I sold the highest price per unit ever to sell in the city of Ontario. So there are some outliers, but there was a particular reason why that happened on that deal that I'll share with you. But in general, the market has been trending sideways. Sales volume is down. Why is that? Two things that I would point to. Number one, we've exceeded the threshold of rental rates. We're at a point where many renters are utilizing more than 50% of their discretionary income to stay in our units. Investors, understanding that, have become a little bit more gun shy, and now you put rent control into the mix. So, second, buyer optimism has began to wane, especially with rent control. Because if they're looking to reposition a property, unless they're looking to do significant capital improvements, they have to purchase the property on where are the rents today, plus, maybe plus the 5% if the owner hasn't raised rents within the last year. Now micro, let's talk 605 corridor. 605 corridor being Montebello, Whittier, Norwalk, and the surrounding area. The bar graph on your left is, again, the sales volume, which is down. The line graph that overlays it is the price per unit. And we see here that the price per unit, as it's ticked up, you compare it with the graph on your right, which is months to sale. This essentially tells us that the buildings are sitting on the market longer. Yes, there have been a few outlier sales, thus moving the price per unit, but with that, now buyers have backed off and buildings are staying on the market longer. In the East San Gabriel Valley, your Almanis, Baldwin Parks, Azusas, Glendoras, there's been more of a meeting of the minds here recently between buyer and seller. So the line graph on your left, price per unit has actually started to come down, but days on market has also come down. So that's why I say buyer and sellers have had more of a meeting of the minds in terms of price point. It's not taking the buildings as long to sell. East Los Angeles. Now, East Los Angeles is an interesting animal because before statewide rent control, they already had their rent freeze that's in place. Me and my wife own some buildings there. And if you're not familiar, the rent freeze was basically you could only raise your rent 3% per year. Now, for those of you who own in unincorporated areas, that's why this happened to East LA. All of unincorporated Los Angeles has been under this rent freeze. Particular to this area, what they're now considering for unincorporated is it would be 3% plus the cost of living, no longer a freeze, but permanent rent control in place. So the way this proposed statewide rent control works is that if your local community has a much more stringent ordinance in place, you must follow that one. So here in the unincorporated areas, you would not be allowed to raise it 5% plus cost of living. It actually would be 3% plus cost of living. And last I read, they plan to put this into place come this September. So in that particular market, buildings are sitting around a little bit longer, people not as excited given the rent freeze. Now, the coveted Pasadena. So you look at the price per unit, you have things hitting almost $400,000 per unit. Now, days on market have began to rise. And those in Pasadena, the owners in Pasadena the last couple of years here have had a tackle with, is there going to be rent control in Pasadena? Is there not? Well, now you get statewide rent control, so they did it for you. West San Gabriel Valley, Rosemead, Temple City, that general area. Price per unit has come down. Days on market continues to rise. So are you beginning to catch a sense of what's going on in the marketplace? Buyers are saying, essentially, we're not happy with that price or we want a greater return for our capital, and until we see it, you can keep your building and leave it on the market. 710-91 corridor. The sales volume here down again. Price per unit is trending sideways, and the days on market is beginning to tick up. Now, Inland Empire West, if you look at the days on market, it's dropped dramatically because the Inland Empire West being your Pomona, Ontario, Montclair, Claremont, since it's more affordable compared to Los Angeles County, a lot of investors have flocked there because there also has been a significant run-up in rents. I just purchased a building there that I'll share with you here in a few minutes and what's going on there and why I put my own capital up in the area. So the Inland Empire West, a lot of money has flocked there. Unlike the Inland Empire East, Colton, Bloomington, Fontana, as the price went up per unit, days on market shot up. But that being said, you look at the fluctuations, it's like a hate-love. At some point, the investors love the area, then not so much. Unsure of, can those cities maintain the rental rates of where they are? Is there enough employment in the area? So we take an overall look at the marketplace, and we say, okay, let's maximize what we currently own. And as I mentioned this morning, it's through capital improvements. And I mentioned that in the new proposed statewide rent control, the way it's written, they actually have incentivized you to do major capital improvements. So the way it's written is that if you do something like a complete replumb of the building, new electrical, extensive construction that would take up to 30 days or more, you can actually give the tenants 1 month worth of rent, and you can have them vacate your unit. So now the question becomes, how do you analyze this? Well, what's my current rent? What's the market rent? And we're going to go through some of these. And with that difference, does it justify me doing something like giving all the tenants 1 month rent, vacating, staying vacant 1 to 2 months, and the cost of the improvement? If we go in that direction, then we have to ask ourselves, okay, who's going to pay me tip top? You really have two types of renters then. So let's say you have tenant A. Tenant A sees home ownership as a negative. Tenant B is saving every nickel and dime they can because they favor home ownership. They're just staying at your place a little while, but they truly want to own their own home. Tenant A is putting off marriage till later in life, thus having children later in life, so they have more discretionary income. Tenant B has children earlier in life, favors large families, thus less money to spend on rent. Tenant A is typically two professionals that are cohabitating, two incomes. Tenant B, a lot of times, is one income. Now, if you're a betting man or woman, which tenant would you assume is going to pay the higher rent? It's tenant A. Tenant A is the millennial. Tenant A sees home ownership as a negative, and they're willing to spend up to 55% of their discretionary income in rent, so long as you offer the right amenities. To top it off, they're the largest portion of the population today. So a millennial, if you're unfamiliar with the term, is those individuals that are between, say, 25 and 35, that general area. So how do we attract them? Now, the most aggressive would be like the downtown lofts that have been built, where there's a pool on the rooftop, indoor cafe and gymnasium, a doggy run. If you're like my wife and I, we have buildings owned in the 50s and 60s. We can't offer those type of amenities. But what we can offer is a nice rental unit. So this is actually a property that my wife and I had bought a couple of years ago. And the pictures you're looking at now was the condition it was in when we purchased it. Some of you are thinking, hey, that's not a bad looking unit. That's not how you attract a millennial. That's not how you get the highest rent. In its current condition, I could have put some lipstick and maybe got $1,200 given the community and the bedroom count. I did extensive capital improvements. So this is the after. And we go through the buildings, okay? So when I eat my own cooking, as they say. So when I say massive capital improvement, new plumbing, electrical, kitchens, bathrooms, floorings, and all the rest. Instead of $1,200, I'm collecting over $1,800. So you can do the math after how many months did the tenant essentially pay for my rehab. Now this unit last me through my retirement because I've done all there is that needs to be done for the property, and or if I go to cash out refinance, it's worth that much more. If I go to exchange my building versus another building that's on the market, going into the type of market we're going into, my building becomes a tiebreaker. You choose mine because of its condition and my rents. Here's another example. This is a unit that I bought in Maywood here just recently. This was a tiny unit, a one-bedroom unit. Now, when I say tiny, if you were holding on to the doorknob of the front door, you could grab hands of the person in the one bedroom, and that person could grab hands of the person in the bathroom. I mean, it's tiny, tiny one bedroom. In the previous condition, they were paying $900. And the owner, the individual who sold this to me, thought that was actually, I guess, rentable condition. I extensively renovated it. Now I'm collecting $1,400 for a tiny one bedroom. And this is in Maywood, in case you're wondering, the city. $1,400 for $1,425 for a one bedroom. So the idea here is that, I've sold some buildings where you walk in the living room and there's one type of tile. You turn into the bedroom, there's another type of tile because that was on sale at Home Depot. You go in the kitchen, and the idea of a remodel was some new linoleum, paint over the 1960s cabinets, maybe replace one cabinet just because that one broke and it couldn't be painted over. And some people call that a day. I'm not here to knock anyone if that's their approach, but what I'm suggesting to you is, at the moment when we're facing rent control, and you have tenants that are maybe paying 20, 30% below market rate, it's a consideration to do some of these capital improvements so that you can then vacate those units and obtain market rent. This is a property that I just purchased in Ontario. Now, my escrow is going on while this rent control thing is heating up. This is a 5-unit property, and the tenants, if you can believe it or not, were paying $750 and $800 per unit. The woman who sold the building actually built the building with her husband, and they had owned it since the 1960s, and apparently never raised rent. How that hurt her, I didn't represent her. I bought that from an agent. It was on the open market. Maybe some of you saw this deal just a couple months ago. I ended up buying it, 5 units, all 2-bedroom, 1-bath, single story, good size units, big backyards, $760,000. Good buy. That woman, the seller, who was elderly and retired, and she was selling and riding off into the sunset, would have obtained at least another $150,000 for the sale of her building had she had the right rents in place. I wouldn't have been the buyer at that point, but somebody would, knowing values in the area, somebody would have. Now, so I mentioned I'm in the middle of rent control while this is going on. To understand how this works, if I would have gave the tenants a notice to increase rent when I took over in September and August, the rent control bill has a rollback feature, meaning whatever your rents were in March 15th, everyone in this room gets to take their rents back to what they were on March 15th if your last rent increase was more than the proposed rent cap. You follow? So if your tenant was paying $1,000 on March 14th and you gave them a $100 rent increase, that's 10% on March 16th, you get to go back to $1,000 come this January 1st of the new year. That's how the rent control bill works. So my escrow, $750. Even if I would have worked something out with them to say, hey, let's agree on $1,100. Market is $16. Let's agree at $1,100, which is what I would have done. It becomes law. Now my rents would have went back to $750. Can you imagine raising rents 7% on $750 once per year for the coming years? Makes no financial sense. So the government forced my hand. I gave everyone a 60-day notice to vacate. All tenants. 4 of the 5 will be out come this Monday, and we're going to start our construction. And we'll do the same type of rehab that we've done. Now, to sweeten the deal, Stephen Hall assisted me in purchasing this property in an investment trust where my money that sits there in the trust is non-taxable. The growth in the property is non-taxable. I put my rents into this account and they're non-taxable. This is why we bring people like Stephen Hall. For the financing, now, any bank was not going to lend me a traditional loan, even 50%, even a 40% loan to value, given the rents. Bruce Norris and his firm has a loan program. They lent me more than 76% of the value at purchase. And so you understand now, my leverage, I maybe put 24% down. It goes in an investment account. We're going to do the major capital improvements, bring them up to market. That's the idea when we say maximization, okay? Maximizing what it is that we're currently holding. So let's talk rents. What's possible for you? 605 corridor, Montebello, Whittier, Norwalk, Pico, Paramount, and La Puente. For 3 beds, about $1,850. 2 beds, $1,625. 1 bed's $1,225. Studios, $995. East San Gabriel Valley, Glendora, West Covina, Covina, Monrovia, El Monte, Azusa, Baldwin Park. $1,950 for 3s, $1,695 for 2s, $1,450 for 1s, $1,075 for studios. Now, these are all averages. Again, some units may be bigger, smaller. You may have done capital improvements or not. These are averages from a third source. East Los Angeles, El Sereno, East LA, Boyle Heights. $1,750 for 3 beds, $1,495 for 2 beds, $1,295 for 1 beds, $995 for studios. We have all the rents. I don't have time to go through all of them for all the corridors of which you own in, but we do have them. What you want to do, how many of you would like a copy of the slides from our presentations today? Okay, so please help me. You were given those informational cards that were at your seats. Please ensure we have your phone number and your email so that we can converse with you. I gladly will give you the slides. I'll give you the retail locations. We buy all our supplies for our rehabs and tradesmen and what have you. Again, this not proprietary information. I gladly share with you, but I can't get it to you unless I have the right contact information, number one. Number two, that's where you want to jot down your questions for the Q&A session. I'll just mention that here again now. We do not take scraps, pieces of paper, and you brought your own paper. I only take questions. The panel will only take questions from those cards. So please, that's where you want to jot them down. So I have the rents for Pasadena, West San Gabriel Valley, 71091, Inland Empire West, Inland Empire East. And if you want something even more specific to your block where you own a location, my team and I can put a rent survey together for you, no problem. Again, just we need to be able to converse with you. So we take an investor in the room, help them get a hold of what they currently own, increase its valuation so that now they can pivot and move to pillar 2, which is growth, through a 1031 exchange. Now, the client that I'll discuss here is the Sanchez family because it fits many attendees who have come in the past. The Sanchez family, when I met them, had owned their building for about 25 years, free and clear. And when I come into their world, this is where they are. Chris, you don't understand. There's no building like our building. And there's no tenants like our tenants. Even if they're on the welfare plan for rent. Any of you do this plan? You take some on the 1st, some on the 5th, some on the 16th. Some of you do this, okay? Even though some of them were on that plan, there was no other tenants like their building. And after all, Chris, if we sell and exchange, the property taxes are going to go up. We're going to go from no mortgage to a mortgage. There's no way, no how that you could help us earn more net income. Now, I have the liberty of looking from the outside in, and I realized that, but I said, let's just look at the math. Let's take everything else off the table, my opinion, your opinion, but what does the math say? So we did an evaluation. They had $900,000 in equity. So I need to back up. They actually did have a loan. That was a mistake. They did have a loan. So they had $900,000. So if they sold the property at its current value, after closing costs and paying off the first, they would carry over $900,000. I found for them this 17-unit building in Baldwin Park. If you take a look at the gross income on the 10 units, it's $108,000. On the 17 unit, it was $208,000. How does it play out after a mortgage and increase in taxes? Well, these are real numbers. Their net income when they owned the 10 unit was $34,800. After completing the exchange, it jumped to $45,740. That's a 70% increase in the number of units owned, 10 to 17, and it's a 31% increase in net income, net spendable income. Maybe to make that more applicable for you, for every $100 that you currently collect in rental income, what if you could collect 130? And I would put forth the argument that in a state of rent control where maybe you got caught flat-footed and your rents are quite low, an exchange is one of the best ways for you now to start exponentially growing, because tell me this, if they would have held, at what point could they have collected 17 rents on 10 units? I'll give you a minute, you have calculators. At what point? 17 rents on 10 units. It can't be done. Now, for the skeptics that are saying, well, Chris, you're trotting this one out because that's that one unicorn deal. Better yet, it's a leprechaun riding a unicorn, but you can't find me another one of those. Well, let's take a look. Another client in the room, 3 units, East Los Angeles. Net income was $18,000. Now, they had done the capital improvements that I suggested, completely rehabbed to the studs. New insulation, drywall, plumbing, electrical, beautiful. One might say, well, why sell it, right? You've done the improvements, you're obtaining market rent, why? On top of that, they had significant sentimental attachment to the property. Their grandfather owned the property, then their father and uncles, eventually them. I mean, their godmother, her handprint was in the concrete from when she was a little girl with her name signed. It doesn't get much more sentimental than that. But looking at the math, when all was said and done, by doing the exchange into this 8-unit in Maywood, the renovation needed was $100,000. The net income was $52,400. The rate of return on their money was 8.6%. That's almost a 200% increase in cash flow and 160% increase in the number of units owned. Now, that client is myself and my wife. So I'm trying to put forth the idea here that me included, with my godmother's handprint and all, had to step back and at least take a look at the math. Because if I'm being honest with myself and I'm saying, hey, these properties are going to provide for me sometime down the road. I like my standard of living now. I don't want it to change in the future, so I need to replace that in passive income. Instead of always adding new cash to the deal, because some of you maybe don't have that opportunity. I realize maybe there's some doctors and lawyers in the room, and every year you have a big injection of cash you can just buy. But for a lot of us, we're equity rich. It's the equity that we need to put to work in order to change our financial trajectory. So we have to analyze to see if it's ideal. Now, so that we know that this is real. She didn't know I was going to do this, but I'm coming. And she's hiding. So I'd like to introduce you to Rita. I know this is hard, so let's just pretend it's me and you talking. Okay. Now, Rita was just here in March. Prior to March, we had never met, right? We had never met prior to March. You catch the vision of an exchange for you and your family. And I'll hand you the mic. Let's take it from there. How long had you owned your building in Downey when we met?
More than 34 years.
You have to hold it up.
More than 35 years.
Wow. And
a lot of equities there.
Why, in those 35 years, why hadn't you done an exchange earlier?
Oh.
Honestly.
Okay. We thought the income we have is very comfortable. We didn't think about the leverage of the equity in there.
So you come to the luncheon.
Yes.
I remember you and your son Chuck introduced yourself as you were leaving. And many people do. They get excited. They're at an event. Chris, call me. And I never hear from them. I don't get their little card, right? So, but this was different. You invited me to your home. We analyzed it. You owned it for 35 years. You know the tenants inside and out. You know the building inside and out. You're comfortable in terms of your financial means. So why do the exchange?
After your explanation to me to use the equity, we can buy a bigger apartment. So I have bought from 10 units, changed to 14 units. That is about how many? 40%?
40% increase.
Income, yes.
Sure.
And I I'm very happy.
And you just closed escrow on the new building when?
Yes, on the September 25th, a few days ago.
Excellent. Everyone, let's give Rita a round of applause, please. Thank you. So, sorry. Retired, comfortable. What's your excuse? What's my excuse? And I didn't want to trot out her finances to the whole crowd, but not only did she move from Downey to an Orange County location, not only did she move from 10 to 14 units, which is a 40% growth. See, some of you think, well, in order for this thing to make sense, I got to go from 10 to 25, and I don't want to own 25, so I stay with 10. I looked at the new evaluation, Rita, I remember we discussed, I looked at the new evaluation on the new property, the financials are there. Now, for my A-types in the room, who up to this point think that I've been playing on sentiment, so let's talk some real numbers. If you had, let's say, $500,000 in equity, or maybe not in equity, let's just say you had $500,000 cash, and there's two banks. I think this is the easiest way to compare. The 6 unit is Bank A, and the 10 unit is Bank B. You raise the rents on the 6 units by $50 a month. The income goes up annually by $3,600 a year. And if we do an evaluation of the property based on GRM, gross rent multiplier, so for those of us who are maybe not familiar with the terminology, if you took the gross annual rents, how many times do we have to multiply them to equal the purchase price? Hence, gross rent multiplier. It's one of 4 indicators we use when evaluating property. That would mean that you increase the value of your property by $43,000. Now let's do the same thing on a 10 unit. We raise the rents by $50 per unit, and over the course of the year, that's an increase of $6,000, which equates to an increase in valuation of $78,000. So if you have $500,000, Bank A is paying $43,000, Bank B is paying $78,000, which would we choose? It's this compound effect of by moving into something larger, especially again with rent control, because before, sometimes people would say, well, I'll hold on to what I own and I'm not taking full advantage of the rent, so I'll just raise those. That's a reason not to exchange. Can't do that now unless you're willing to do major capital improvements. And if you've already done the plumbing and electrical, then there's nothing you can point to, so you're stuck. And here, by moving up from, in this case, 6 to 10 units, the exponential factor of raising rents just on those additional 4 units over time, and we can meet, I can show you, let's say over a 10-year period, dwarfs anything the 6 unit would do. Growth. Now, so we've grown over time. Now we say, okay, no more growing. I'm just ready to prepare either for an exit out of the real estate game. I'm just doing estate planning, something like this. But as I analyze things, what if in my heart of hearts, I would like to sell, but I don't want to deal with Uncle Sam because he'll take 35, 40, 50% for some of you in terms of your equity. So it's not just an option to exchange and cash out. You've looked at triple nets, triple net leases, but it's not, you don't want to own a Dollar Tree in Timbuktu, so that's just not appealing. Nothing against Dollar Tree. I'm just get the idea. Some of you are just not comfortable with a triple net lease. So if I don't want to cash out and I don't want a triple net lease, but I want to relieve myself of the management and I just want monthly income, what can I do when the banks are only paying, saying 1% to 2%, depending? Well, you could sell and carry the financing. Now, the Becker family who's in the room today, when we first met, I had sold them a building in Covina. I think that was the first transaction. Right, Chuck? I forget. I think it was. But anyways, we make each other's acquaintance. And he actually bought a building for almost $100,000 a unit in West Covina. You can believe this. Or Covina, I mean, at the time. It's crazy to think where things were at one point. Anyways, Chuck has a medical condition, begins to think, hey, if I go down and all the units fall in my wife's lap, I don't necessarily want her to deal with tenants. I want her to have the income. That's been the whole idea, these properties for retirement, but I don't want her to deal with all the tenant and repairs because Chuck did that. That was his lane. Just like for me and my wife. If I go down, everything falls on my wife's lap, right? This idea where, as right now, primarily I deal with the rentals. So we analyzed it. We said, okay, well, what can we do? Well, if you sell and carry back financing for the buyer, so simple math, let's say you have a property that's worth $1 million. The buyer puts down 30% in cash to you at the close of escrow, so you get $300,000 up front. And the remaining $700,000 you carry back in the form of a note. And you could carry that for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. It's really dependent upon your goals in terms of how long you want that income. The interest rate today probably would be somewhere between 4 to 7%, depending. And so you've relieved yourself of the management, you have monthly income from the note, and you've mitigated the taxes for the amount of time that you carry the note. So how does some of this work financially? I just sold this 5-unit with my partner, Deepan Shah, who brought me up a little earlier. 5 units Ontario, sales price, $1,150,000. This is the one I told you that was the highest price per unit. How did that happen? Well, by offering private financing, instead of just getting 2 offers, I think we got like something close to 8 offers. There's actually a gentleman here sitting in the second row, I won't point you out, that once the bid started getting this crazy, he said, okay, Chris, that's it, I'm out. Actually, 2 gentlemen are in this room who bid on this, and they got so high, they're smart enough, they said, I'm out. The guy who ended up buying it ended up paying $250,000 more than the list price. Now, this is where I do the disclaimer, it goes across the bottom, your results may vary. I'm not saying just because you carry back financing, you're gonna have this huge upswing in price, but you're gonna have more offers, especially in a rent control market where financing is getting tighter. Since you're developing the loan yourself as the seller, you're gonna receive more offers, and with that, we assume a bid process which will increase the price. Now this family, had they just sold and cashed out, they would have netted $1,075,000 from the sale and then would have paid their taxes from there. But what if they carry the financing? We had the buyer put 25% down, $287,500 down initially. The loan amount, $862,000. We carry it at 4.6% annually, so the annual income to them was $39,675, which nearly replicated what they were earning from the property when they were managing it themselves. So when we compare side by side, you could cash out $1,075,000, pay the taxes, or carry the note, in this case for 5 years, and between the initial down payment, the interest payments, and the loan payoff, you net $1,348,375 over the course of the loan. And in addition, you sell it above market pricing. Now, so that you can hear from them why they sold, it's the Inman family, we'll let them share their story.
Little by little, they got renters that came in. And most of their renters ended up being like family orientated. They made it like a family orientated apartment where the people lived there for years. What brought us to the decision to finally sell and move on was we felt we were getting older now, and we do not want the responsibility of having to look after them anymore. And then we also had a gentleman by the name of Chris German come around and call on me for about 1.5 years and asking me, finally he called one day and I was kind of caught off guard. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, if you can come and convince my husband to talk to you because you are in the real estate business, and he doesn't have too much to say about the last real estate decision that we made. So if you can come and talk to him and get him to talk to you about it, then it'll be fine. One of the advantages was that we were getting interest on it for 5 years and made the price of the property go up higher than what we sold it for,
because of the opportunity to the buyer. It was easier for the buyer to take over and set up the financing was all us. We were like the bank, and we liked the interest rate per month. And there was other options we were offered on that, but we chose one that we wanted to do. But if somebody was thinking about selling and don't need the finances, sent to you all at one time, and you can make X amount of dollars per month, more than you're actually making if it was sitting in the bank, it'd be a smart way to go. Because you look at this and the net is almost the same as we had if we owned them, and we have no headaches. I still, and that's a good way to look at it. And I'd recommend this to anybody that wanted to contact us or anything. They were handled very professionally, and that's what I made my decision with.
What Mrs. Inman doesn't reveal in the video is that her father actually built the building. She grew up in the building as a little girl. And I remember as we're closing escrow, the buyer being cognizant of the fact that he was buying it from the builder had asked for the blueprints, and she actually had them. And as she handed us the blueprints, there was tears in her eyes. She felt like she was, I guess, giving away a piece of her parents that she had held on to for all that time. And she acknowledged that was a big reason why they held for as long as they had and hadn't sold prior. But the fact that we sold at the price that we did, that's why Mr. Inman had that big smile ear to ear, is because they felt comfortable with their decision based upon that net price. So where do we go from here? Now, anytime a realtor is going to tell you about the direction of the market, you want to be as skeptical as you would be an economist telling you where the economy is going, or the weatherman what the weather is going to be tomorrow. So with that in mind, I'll just tell you what I see firsthand daily brokering properties. The market is slowing. It has been, I was joking with Bruce Norris at the beginning, it has been some time since I've had to reduce values on properties for them actually to sell. I don't remember honestly doing that since maybe 2012. Not just me. If you watch properties that are on the market, you're looking at LoopNet or Realtor.com or something, they're having to chunk down the prices in order to get some of these properties to move. That's a reality. And that was happening even prior to the passage of rent control. As we look at rent control the way it's proposed now, there's three major moving parts. You have your cap rent increase of 5% plus cost of inflation. You're in need of a just cause eviction. The 60-day notice to vacate, which used to be just cause I don't like you, that's no longer available. And really, what's just cause? It's really in the eye of the beholder, and our next guest is going to dig into some of that. And as I mentioned, your rent increases since March 15th. I have another deal that we're doing right now, buyers in the room. As part of the negotiations before this whole rent control thing, we got the seller to agree to raise rents during the course of escrow so that it would increase his loan amount come the close of escrow. Rent control passes. The bank he was working with, getting wind of this, says, that's it, we're chopping your loan because now we know those rent increases are effectively unusable. This is the reality of the marketplace we're in. With that in mind, and with what Bruce had to share, and Gil, and Steve Hall, my intent here is that you package it all together for yourself to make an educated decision going forward. I'm not here to sell you a bag of goods. The idea being is based upon what's real, not what's hoped for, and based upon your true economic situation and not what we purport it to be. My dad would always say everyone's a legend in their own mind, this whole thing. But if we look at the math, like Gil alluded to, having a game plan, what does my true financial tell me versus my goal? And the goal being the building up and increase of my financial legacy. Now, for my legacy, this is what my legacy looks like. And yes, I do know what causes it. I do have cable and a TV. whichever one. But for my wife and myself, and given our age, I can't just become a victim of the news to the day. I have to pivot on a dime and say, okay, you're gonna throw rent control at me? Well, here's how I need to maneuver and navigate. But I never take my gaze off the financial goal. The goal being, for me at this point and for my wife, is that we're able to provide a certain standard of living for our family. I'm unwilling to shrink that goal to meet a certain finance, and I'm dedicated to expanding that finance to meet the financial goals that I have for my family. For yourself, my question would be just, what is it for you? What pillar are you in? What pillar should you be in? Does it line up with what you truly, ideally had in mind when you got in this whole game? Because you didn't get in this game to take calls in the middle of night for leaky faucets and leaky toilets. I would have to hallucinate that it was because it was about cash flow. Well, then how do we increase that? Now, our next speaker is going to be a real treat. Really has become the crowd favorite. Stephen Spear of Spear, Woodward, Corbelis, Goldberg has been litigating in the courtrooms now for nearly 4 decades. Owns or has ownership through partnerships in over 2,000 units. And just comes from the practical place of that size of ownership and the type of law that he litigates in terms of jury trials to share with us what does he see happening in the marketplace and to really help us tear apart this new rent control law. So with that, please help me welcome to the stage Mr. Stephen Spear.
Thank you, Chris. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I am a real estate attorney, and I'm going to answer questions on any subject you might have. There are people who are walking around the room right now with microphones. And so if you have a question about anything having to do with real estate law or anything connected to it, whether you're having a problem with one of your vendors, with tenants, with a lender, with the city, whatever it would be, including rent control, put your hand up now, high in the air, and keep it there, because there are 4 people who are looking at your hands, and they will bring microphones to you, and at that point, we will take questions from you. And the way this works, it's like popcorn. It starts out very slowly, and people are hesitant to ask a question, and then what happens is at the end, when Chris tells me my time is up, there are 15 hands in the air, and you don't get called on. So get in early rather than late. We're going to start right here with this, with the red microphone. Stand up if you would, sir.
Yes, good morning. So basically, I have a situation with when we bought a property, we inherited the agreement that they had with the laundry room rental. So this company was providing them with the equipment, and the agreement is finishing this month. But when we discovered that there is a clause in the agreement saying that they have the first right of refusal, we've been struggling with this company for the past almost since we bought the property, because they are giving us a...
You don't like them, and you would rather not continue doing business with them, but they're telling you that in the agreement there's a right of first refusal.
Correct.
And so, good, thank you for the question. If you have an agreement, a contract, for example, with laundry, and they tell you there's a right of first refusal, if there is one, you're going to be bound by it. And what a right for first refusal means is if you are going to use another company that provides a similar service, in this case, laundries, washer and dryer, that you can negotiate with them, with that new company, but before you sign it, you have to go back to the old company and give them a chance to sign a contract with you on those terms. Now, you don't want that because you want to get rid of them. So the first advice I would have is when you enter into your laundry agreements, read them. If you don't feel like you fully understand every single clause, it's worth a 1-hour consultation with a real estate attorney to figure out whether you're going to be bound to something that you don't want to be bound to. And so as a consequence, you wouldn't sign that. You would negotiate that out. In this case, you have to do it, but there is an exception. If you don't go with another outside company and instead you bring in your own laundry equipment, in most cases you will get around the right of first refusal. You'll be able to use your own laundry equipment instead. And the next question is the yellow microphone right over here in the back.
Steve.
Yes.
Steve. Just because a lot of people asked on the way in, so if you could for us, just cause. What equates to a just cause? How do you break apart this rent control?
Great. So rent control with just cause, if someone has been in the premises for 12 months, or if any one of the people has been in the property, then you need to wait until the last person who got there has been there for 12 months. Then you need just cause in order to remove them. It used to be in California, before this rent control law passed, that you could give someone a 30 or a 60-day notice as was appropriate for a good reason or for no reason at all, and you could send them out the door. Now, you can't do that anymore. Under the new rent control law, it has to be just cause. And that would be any variety of things. There are a list of about 10 things. One of them would be non-payment of rent, of course. Another one is if they're committing crimes in the property. Another one would be if they're laying waste to the property. Another one, there are a bunch of them, and there's a list, and you go by this list. Now, here's the problem. Anytime you have a new law, it takes years before enough lawsuits are brought and enough courts have ruled on the lawsuits, and enough of those cases have gone up to the appellate court or the California Supreme Court before we really know what those laws mean. So the law is written by the legislature, the California Assembly, the California Senate, and you'd hope they could write a clear law. I've read this law. It has a bunch of things that are ambiguous. So there are things we're not going to know. So my suggestion is that if you want to get a tenant out, that you use one of the other reasons where you don't need just cause, if you can do that. If you need just cause, be careful. You don't want to be one of those test cases that goes up to the Supreme Court. But there's a list. It's easy to find. It's in a bunch of different places. To the yellow microphone in the back. Stand up if you would. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I have a 3 unit in Lake Arsenal, and my water main just break, so I had to call a plumber. The lady told me I had to rent a hotel. Do I have to pay for the hotel? I have the right to fix it?
So when you are a landlord and you have a tenant and something breaks, a water main breaks, it wasn't your fault, and you have a tenant who says, look, you say to your tenant, you got to move out because we're going to have to do all this. And what they should do is they should pay you the rent and you should put them up in a hotel. I am not telling this to your tenants. I'm telling this to you as fellow landlords. If you have a situation for a few $100 more where you can buy your peace with someone by abating the rent or putting them in a little nicer hotel, that's a much better idea than trying to figure out what's the minimum I have to do and then have them fall into the clutches of one of the law firms that specializes in coming after landlords and, I won't use the word extortion, but squeezing you until money pops out. So my suggestion is, if you have an attitude about your tenants that they are your customers, and if you provide them with clean, safe, properly operating space, and when something goes wrong, if you go out of your way, just as you'd expect in a fine restaurant, if the meat is overcooked or something is wrong, that the restaurant will bring you something fresh or take it off your bill and be apologetic about it. That should be your approach to your tenants. If you do this, you won't end up, you greatly reduce the chances of landing yourself with a new nickname, the nickname being defendant. We'll go to the red microphone, then the green microphone. Keep your hand in the air until a microphone gets to you. Sir.
About the CPI and the rent control bill, is that well defined, or is that one of those things that's going to wend its way through the courts? Is it regional? Is it a one-year look back? What is it?
It's a great question, and the answer is no, it's not well written. No, it's not well defined. The rule is you can raise the rent 5% plus inflation, not more than twice a year, not to exceed 10%. And what is inflation is one of the questions that's raised. And that the answer ends up being probably your local CPI for consumers, probably the one that excludes the cost of housing and the cost of fuel. But it's not clear. There will be lawyers who take the position that you have to apply the lower standard. So here's the advice we're giving. We know that inflation right now is not at zero, and it's not lower than zero. We know that it's higher than zero. I think everybody would agree it's at least 1%. I think most people would agree it's 2%. Some people would argue it's 3 or 4%. If you want absolutely no risk right now, don't raise more than 5%, because 5% is flatly legal. If you'd like to take just a greater amount of risk, then raise it 6%, because 1% inflation on top of the 5 is very justifiable. Nobody's going to claim you're acting in bad faith. If you like a little more risk, try 7. And if you are a skydiver, go higher. So for that reason, my suggestion is that, again, you want these laws to be tested on someone else, not on you. Green microphone, and after that, we'll go to the yellow microphone. Green.
Hi, this question doesn't have any overarching significance to anyone perhaps but me. I have a tenant. They moved in as a young couple. It's a modest, well, I shouldn't say modest, but small one-bedroom apartment. Presently, they're up to child number 3. I've got toys cascading down their balconies and off their steps, and it's quite a scene. And occasionally, the mother-in-law comes to stay. It's a one-bedroom place, now with 5 residents, sometimes 6 with a guest. Can I raise their rent, or is there anything I can do about that situation?
So you can raise the rent within the rent control limits if you're not otherwise within some other rent control ordinance. But in statewide rent control, there's not a limit on you can't raise it for people. You just can't raise it more than 5% plus inflation with all those other sub-rules that I recited a moment ago. So what I would tend to do first is, if you're a landlord, you need to have the name of every single human being that is in the unit. So if there are babies, you want their names on there, and you want to call them minors, M-I-N-O-R. So it would be Susie Smith, comma, a minor, comma, Billy Smith, comma, a minor, and you have them on there. This becomes important when you have tenants who are 16 or 17 years of age, because soon they'll turn 18. And you want to know their date of birth, because on their 18th birthday, you want to do 2 things. You want to come out and wish them happy birthday. And you want to present them with the lease that they will now sign. And their name will go on the lease. And if they won't do that, they aren't going to be allowed to stay. They're going to be failing to agree to sign a new lease along the lines of the old one, which is one of the exceptions for just cause under the new rent control law. And again, that's not black and white. That's in the gray area, but we think you will probably be able to show just cause for that. And so you're going to want to evict them. On the general proposition where you have a lot of people, that's something where you can raise the rent all the way to the market as long as it doesn't exceed these rent control rules. If you're already at market and you have people who are bringing people in that are not on the lease and you don't want that, then you should say to them, you're placing an undue burden on the property, and we need you to not have these people living here, or we need you to pay more rent, or we need you to leave. But again, you're going to run afoul of the just cause rules. Under the new rule, maybe. But that's something that'll be on an individual basis. You'd have to be able to describe the conduct. So one of the things that is just cause is if they're laying waste to the property. So if toys are falling off the balcony and hitting cars or people, if there are things that you can describe that to an objective observer is going to be able to tell you exactly what that would be, then I think that's something that could work out well. What the law is that you must act in good faith. And so courts look to and promote good faith behavior according to reasonable standards. And so to figure out what good faith is, I went and I looked up good faith. in Black's Law Dictionary. Black's Law Dictionary is a dictionary that lawyers use. It defines words that have been held to mean certain things in court. So I wanted to see what is the standard to which a landlord is held. It's a good faith standard. What does it mean? Black's Law Dictionary, good faith. Good faith is an intangible and abstract quality with no technical meaning or statutory definition. So I thought, all right, I'll look up bad faith in Black's Law Dictionary. Maybe that's going to give me some idea of what the standard might be. Black's Law Dictionary, bad faith, the opposite of good faith. So this is in the eye of the beholder. The beholder is the judge, is the jury. That's who gets to look at it. And again, this is not a conversation about how to win in court. This is a conversation about how not to get sued to begin with. So what did I say? Orange microphone, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. I have a 5-unit building with low rents, increased the rents June. A front house and 4 additional units. The front house had the lowest rent, so I raised all the rents to market. On the front house, I put a total new roof. Is that considered rehab? So that I could justify the market rents.
So the rehab rule is going to give you an opportunity to vacate the unit. You didn't vacate the unit, you put the roof on, so that is not going to have any effect on anything having to do with rent control. What you might be thinking of is the City of Los Angeles Rent Stabilization Ordinance, which has been in effect since the late 1970s in Los Angeles. And what it said is that when you do capital improvements, those get passed through to the tenant 1/60th per month. In other words, you can pass the whole cost on over 5 years to the tenants in terms of a rent increase. But that's not in the state law. The state law says that where the city law is more stringent than the state law, that the city law will prevail. But is that more stringent or more lenient? That's another thing that's going to work its way through the court system. Yellow microphone.
2 simple questions. 1, to reduce the risk of just cause, would you recommend shortening leases to maybe 6 months so that if a tenant turned out not to be a good one, you could get rid of them?
Courts look to and promote good faith behavior according to reasonable standards, and most judges are going to look at that and say, well, that's not the spirit of the law, so no. It is something which will be litigated, and some judges will say one thing, some judges will say another thing, and that's how things go up the chain to the Court of Appeal and ultimately to the California Supreme Court. Any lawyer who stands up and says, I know the answer to that question, is wrong. Whatever they think, they don't know the answer to that question because it's a great question, but it hasn't been defined. It hasn't been defined. Red microphone.
I have a property in Covina, and I had a neighbor for 20 plus years, and drainage has never been a problem, even after the torrential rains in January. I had a painter do some painting, and apparently he cleaned some brushes or whatever. The water ran off from the patio under the adjoining fence into his property, down the steps, and now he's claiming that because of the drainage situation, mine's slightly higher apparently, that I need to dig a trench, cut through a block wall and make a hole so that the water stays away from his property. In the past, on another property I own.
And this was occasioned because a painter drained paint onto his property?
Yeah, because of the elevation of the water when he was hosing the
Got it. So he became aware of the water flow because of the paint and the water, but the water flow has been unchanged for decades.
Over 20 years.
And your question is?
Well, one, do I need to dig a trench on my side? Who's responsible for drainage?
So, it is one of the things that the law very intelligently figures out, and this is not, laws are not always smart, but one of the things that the legislature has actually gotten right is that water flows downhill. And so the law is that you must accept water from your uphill neighbor. water that flows from your uphill neighbor to your downhill neighbor, you must accept it. The exception to that is when you've changed the topography of the uphill property, you've changed it, and now water which didn't used to flow down now flows down, that you can create damage with. And there are all kinds of laws about tree roots and everything else, but with respect to water, those two rules are the basic large rules. There are lots of other details, but those are the two basic rules. So the short answer to do I need to dig a trench and do I need to change something, the short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is, oh my goodness, no. And are you responsible? Yes, because there was paint in it. So if they said, you've painted my driveway, or came on the tires of my car, I need you to get, you might have to make repairs, you might have to be responsible for that. But in principle, when you are draining water, the neighbor has to take it. Sir.
My question is some landlords like to charge a higher rent and they don't like to charge a late fee, but then they say they give you a discount from that higher rent. And on the new law for increasing the rent, it could be, and is the 5% plus CPI based on that higher rent, or is it on what they actually collect from the tenant?
The legislature wrote the law in a way that said that all of these basic lowest numbers are where they count from. So if there's a discount, rent concessions don't count, but other things do. So if you had a number which is artificially pumped up but then discounted every month, the court is going to say the discounted number is the number in reality. There's nothing illegal about saying your rent is higher, and if you pay by this date, your rent is lower. That would be okay, as long as it didn't exceed the 6% per monthly payment limit. But for rent control purposes, it isn't going to help you. Did I say orange microphone next, then red,
yes.
then yellow? Go.
The question I have, we've got two units exactly alike. One is rented at $1,000 a month, and the other one is rented at $1,500 a month. The market rent is $1,800 a month. The first tenant moves out at $1,000 a month. I want to go in and do all the repairs and raise that rent up to $1,800. The second tenant moves out.
So let's stick with the first tenant first. So no problem, because that's vacancy where the tenant is voluntarily leaving, I gather from your question.
Yes.
And they leave and they're gone. We still have, for the moment in California, vacancy decontrol, meaning if the tenant voluntarily leaves, you can then move the rent straight to market. Don't stop, don't pass go, just go straight there. So on that first unit, that's the answer.
That answers the question for the second unit. Thank you.
Great, perfect, red microphone.
I was one of those ones that have kept, so is Mary next to me, I found out, kept the rents low. I've got a lot of 20 plus year tenants. I've got 2 duplexes on the same property, same exact floor plan, et cetera. I'm getting $1,700. I've got a couple of people that have been there about 20 years, 2 different units, and they were $1,350. And, they're good tenants, et cetera, and I've kept them. But now I feel like I'm getting kind of, maybe I was stupid, I guess, whatever, but didn't listen to Chris saying to raise the rents. But at any rate...
You weren't stupid, but you didn't listen to Chris.
Right.
What can I say?
Well, that might equate to stupid anyhow, but I'm a nice guy, I guess, whatever. They're good tenants, they're good to me, I've kept them down. At any rate, so when this was all kind of coming up back in March, they were $1,350. So I thought, okay, I'll keep it below 10%. So July 1st, I had them start $1,475, which was a little less than 10%. So what do I have to do now? If it goes back to, do I have to go back to March 15th? They were paying $1,350. Is that what they need to be starting January?
You need to go back to whatever it was March 15 of this year plus 5% plus inflation. So
I can go that 5% plus the inflation then from March 15th. So I kind of did a rough figure. So I raised them to $1,475. And if I do 5-6%, it's maybe I'm going to have to roll them back to $1,420. Is that?
You will do the math, and whatever the math is, that's the math. All right, orange, then yellow, then red, and I think I'm out of time. Put your hands up if you have a question so everybody can see it. If we have more time, we'll get microphones to you. Go.
I want to, Ellis,
property, 8 unit, with 3 vacant. After I do that, or should I do that first before I do
Should you do what first?
Ellis it first, or do a TI?
Ellis is a San Francisco law. Is that where you are?
No, I'm in Los Angeles rent control, but I want to either decide to do a TIC on the building or do a Ellis first.
Okay,
And
so
I would
how
still have
is
remaining
Ellis connected with a property in Los Angeles?
to vacate with state statute.
Somebody needs to straighten me out on this if I'm wrong. I don't think that Ellis is in Los Angeles. I think it's in San Francisco.
It's statewide.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
So
do you Ellis first or?
Do a TIC.
Those are, a TIC is a tenant in common agreement with who?
No, it's a tenant in common state statute to sell the property off as units as opposed to an income property.
So you're connecting a whole bunch of principles. One is rent control, another one is capital gains tax, another one is the manner in which title is held, and I don't understand the question. Probably too complicated for this forum.
Okay.
I would love to help, but I don't understand the question. Yellow microphone, and then green and red. Go. Sorry, sir. Go.
Yes, I want to know if the just cause has taken effect in California.
Yes, it has. And the green microphone.
Real quick, so we're gonna, as a reminder, we're gonna be cutting off this portion of Q&A. We're gonna go to the larger Q&A, which Steve is still a part of. To be a part of that, so we're without the microphones here, you're gonna submit your questions on these cards. So if my staff could return the mics to the sound booth and start collecting these cards, please, with all the questions. We're gonna collect them from everybody, but we'll continue with this question.
So the green microphone will be the last question in this format. If you have a card, hold it high in the air and keep it up until someone takes it out of your hand, because those will be the questions that we will all be responding to. Ma'am.
Yes, this is going back a little bit to who you just spoke with a couple people before. I thought that when you had 1 bedroom that qualifies for 3 people, 2 bedrooms, 5 people, and I was told that by the housing authority in Los Angeles, because
You're right, and the city of Los Angeles has specific rules on this. Other cities don't.
I'm Los Angeles County, and it counted for that.
Okay.
Because this was in the city of Southgate.
So if you're in the city of Southgate, or you're in the if you're in a jurisdiction where there are rules that specifically say that there are limits to how many people you can have in a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, then the violation of those rules, to answer the gentleman's question from earlier, that statute would enable you to do a just cause eviction if you can prove that that's how many people are in there, and so you've got to be able to prove that. That would be a just cause eviction because they're violating an applicable law, which is one of the 10 exceptions to the just cause rule.
Okay, that I needed to get that
Great.
straight.
Thank you very much. And now we're going to go to the portion. Great questions, by the way. Practice safe sales, ladies and gentlemen. It's a good idea. We're now going to go to the portion where Chris reads questions and each of us give answers.
So the question of age, 2004 and older for rent control, and does that change every year?
What this is meant to do is to address the deep concern that people have over the notion that rent control might make worse the housing shortage by discouraging developers from developing apartment buildings and high density properties. And so they say, well, you'll have 15 years to make money. This isn't going to work very well because real estate developers who are then selling to real estate owners understand that if they're buying a brand new property, they'll pay a premium for that. And it might take them a decade before they really turn profitable. Then they only have 5 years to reap those benefits. And then if they were to sell, then they have limitations on that. It is also very foreseeable that the same way as Proposition 10 came, was voted down, it failed, and yet the legislature passed this. Right now, it's the nose of the camel in the tent with 5% plus inflation. Expect that they're going to change it to 4, 3, 2, 1, or 0 plus inflation. Right now, for example, the city of Los Angeles is at 3%. You've got all kinds of rules that will be stringent. So as a consequence, you can't count on that 15 years remaining the same. But if it's less than 15 years old, under many circumstances, it's exempt.
So for the entire panel, so there's been a lot of talk about a systemic event, things brewing in the market. So for each speaker, what do they make of the current market?
I think right now interest rates are the systemic event. Our rates are down on loans, and properties are qualifying for more loan dollars these days on purchases, as well as refinances.
And in the grand scheme of things, just we see a lot of things coming to a head, given, obviously you have a lot of intel, you work with Chase, so what does Chase thinks coming down the pike?
We've raised our, you were speaking of a bubble earlier. Chase is tightening its underwriting criteria, which although rates are dipping, we are raising our underwriting rates, requiring more liquidity when either buying or refinancing properties. So we're getting more stringent.
From a systemic perspective, I think two key data points here. One, last week with the Fed, with the repo rates, where they injected $100 billion into the system. That tells you there's a liquidity problem for the banks to give their customers some of the cash that they're requesting out of their bank statement. And two, what you just mentioned from Chase Bank, you're tightening the underwriting requirements for landlords to take cash out of a asset or to buy an asset. So when you look at, and the third point I forgot to mention, Chris, you articulated the peak pricing, and overall, that based on the trends, you're starting to see a downward trend. So systemically, I think we've hit a peak in the marketplace, and we're going to start seeing a downturn, because the only way you can fuel an increase in pricing is liquidity in the marketplace with mortgage lending. For example, Bruce, earlier you mentioned that in 2006, lenders were giving stated income loans, and then you saw your charts. You know, the trustee sales dropped to the record lows, and then about 18 to 36 months later, we saw record highs of foreclosures. So systemically, I think we're going to start seeing a tightening of the liquidity markets, which means that we'll start seeing a downward trend towards pricing.
Many different factors. The key factor is, are we going to turn into Japan and have 10 years, a decade of spending and increasing our debt structure? That could well be the case. The key here is where rates go as far as that's concerned. One factor that we're seeing currently, as Chase mentioned, is just because rates get better doesn't dictate lenders get more aggressive and lending you more. Matter of fact, we're seeing the opposite of that now. So we still have some lenders that haven't taken that position, but chances are they will.
Almost forgot the question, but I think the answer I was going to give was probably given. I'll tell you what I'm most concerned about is the direction we're headed politically. At the end of each meeting that we have a fundraiser every year, and I have panel that are top brains in the business in the whole country, like chief economist of Fannie Mae, that type of guy. And at the end of every meeting, I say my wish is for the next 4 years that we don't have Democrats, we don't have Republicans, that everybody in a position of power acts like an American first.
My view is, with all of the doom and gloom over rent control and everything else, I'll speak for myself. We own industrial buildings, commercial properties, office properties, and about 2,200 apartment units. We just closed last week on the purchase of a 115-unit apartment building in Tacoma, Washington. I am a buyer. I am not a seller. I believe in it. There are going to be plenty of ways to profit greatly from owning apartments. And the reason is that you are never going to see a time when competition from China, India, or whoever the next China or India is, or competition from the internet is going to replace apartments, because people can't sleep on the internet. You still need a place to live. A business can decide to do business in a warehouse out in the desert and fly things in on drones. A business can decide to have a laptop and a cell phone and do business sitting in Starbucks, but people can't sleep at Starbucks. They'll need an apartment. So as we see shopping centers tending to decline, retail space, office space tending to, you simply need less of it. You do not need less housing, you need more housing. And the silver lining to the very dark rent control cloud is it's going to make shortages of housing even worse, which is going to have the effect of having upward pressure on prices and more pressure on the legislature to not tighten rent control more. So I'm optimistic.
For the financial guys, are we going to 0% rate, and what would that mean?
Yeah, I think we are. And what's interesting is it's almost in relationship to what other people are doing. So one of our reasons, the reason our 10-year is at 1.6 is because I forget the percentage, but something around 20 or so percent of the world's currency is already in negative, and they're not having big recessions yet. I read an IMF paper that talked about get ready for -3 and -4%. So I think the answer is yes.
And what does that mean to the layperson? If we go to 0 or negative, what does that mean?
Well, I like Warren Buffett's comment. It turns everything upside down. It's not been around before. So in real estate terms, it makes stuff really affordable. So the trouble is when I look at affordability, when affordability is really high, usually the real estate market stinks. 2009, 10, 11, 12, affordability is at 50%. And your stuff was down by half, and I sold all of mine, so mine wasn't. But if you had it, it went down by half, and it was more affordable then than ever. So it'd be interesting to see, can you have a recession with a mortgage rate that starts with a 2 and have no price boom because it just allows it to maintain. So it's because it's affordable, it kind of mitigates the downside. This is uncharted territory, it really is.
The market has tested the 146 barrier of treasuries 4 times since 2013. Every time it hits, it bounces back quickly and reverts back to 3 1/4. That's been our trading range. Not to say it can't break. The real question is, do we have any black swans element as far as liquidity where there won't be money? Matter of fact, bonds will retrace and actually even go higher as far as rates are concerned. If not, as Bruce said, we can be Japan for the next 10 years and get 2%. The real question is, at 2%, what will a lender require and will you qualify? More than likely, the hurdle rate will increase drastically.
I would tell you that this comes back to the concept, the way this will impact all of us is on buy and sell decisions. There is no correct time to buy. There is no correct time to sell. There are only correct and incorrect ways to sell or buy. And so if a property is properly financed and properly priced relative to the income it generates, that's what you're looking for. And if your financing is stable and long-term stable, then you simply make slightly less money in the short run. In the long run, we still live in a country where total strangers will buy real estate for you, and those strangers are called tenants.
I want to add one more comment. When you look at Japan and you look at the current interest rate environment, you have to look at population trends. Because when you look at the chart Chris talked about earlier, you have 80 million millennials that are going to be our tenant base coming the next generation. But then there's another comment on a demographic, a population called the baby boomers. And the reason why I stress baby boomer is because in the 40s, we had a baby boom where everybody was having babies. And the key driver to grow an economy is family. For example, with Chris, you're a great example of what the Census Bureau wants. They want everybody to have a family of 7 or 8 or 9. And the reason why, if you look at the Hispanic population at the southwest of the U.S., the average Hispanic family has at least 3 children. That is going to be the saving grace, the next generation for our economy. Because in Japan, the average family has less than 1 child. And as a result, they have that economic crisis because they had a baby boom similar to the U.S. in the 40s, yet the next generation did not continue that trend. And they do not have a very positive immigration policy. Whereas in the U.S., we have a positive immigration policy that brought in an influx of immigrants that had large families. And that's our saving grace to propel our economy in the future. So what Stephen said earlier, that there's no perfect answer. The common denominator through any country is going to be birth trends and what happens. As long as we continue to encourage higher birth rates, we will see a growing economy.
If anyone has a question and you hasn't been picked up, hold your hand way up high in the air with your card. One of the runners will come around and grab it. There's a hand over here, another one over here. Hold your cards up, and staff will grab the cards. Over here, several cards.
Yeah, if you want copies of the slides and everything we discussed, ensure we get your card turned in, please. Okay. Do you need just cause not to renew a lease?
No, because you're not required to renew the lease. If the lease expires, now it's month to month, you're not required to renew the lease. You just can't throw the tenant out without just cause. So, no. But you can require the tenant to sign a new lease if you want, and if they refuse to, under similar terms and conditions and within the rent control limits, then you can evict them for that because that is just cause. Put another way, it's a complicated mess with unpredictability. If you're in question of it, have a 1-hour consultation with a real estate attorney, and neither I nor any other attorney make our living when you have a 1-hour consultation. We make our living when you don't.
If a landlord has a no pet policy, it comes back to the emotional support animals. We get this question every time. Can you ask for proof? What type of proof? This type of thing?
No. You can have a no pet policy, and if someone says, this is my pet, you can say, you can't bring your pet in here. But the moment someone says, this is my emotional support animal, or this is my service animal, the answer is, come on in. And if you would like to know what the services the pet provides, too bad. If you'd like to know what the need is that this pet is serving, too bad. You can't ask for their papers. You can't ask any questions about it. That's the state of California law, has been now for about 4 years. I keep thinking it's going to change because it's crazy. You now see dogs on buses. You see them at Disneyland. You see them everywhere. And this is my support animal. I can't ride Space Mountain unless I have my dog with me. And so that's the position they're taking, and it's supported by law for right now. So don't ask any questions once someone says it's a support animal. Just say, come on in. Now, if they're laying waste to the property, or I suppose if they're laying waste on the property, then you can say the behavior of the dog is wrong and you can correct the behavior, and that is grounds for just cause. It's grounds for general eviction if you've given a notice to cure or quit and it hasn't been cured.
If you've raised your rents beyond the 5% rent cap, let's say it was above and beyond the CPI 2, what's a landlord to do?
Well, the first thing you're going to have to do is take it back to the language, to what it was on March 15th of this year. And the question is, are you going to have to give a refund? And I'm pulling out the paper because there's specific language. And this is just an example of how badly this whole thing has been written, if I can find it quickly enough. An owner shall not be liable to the tenant for any corresponding rent overpayment. So if you've been overpaid by the tenant, it says, an owner shall not be liable to the tenant for any corresponding rent overpayment. Does that mean you don't have to give a refund? This is going to be a litigated provision, because someone somewhere is going to say, I want my money back. Some landlord is going to say no, and then there'll be a litigation, and then we'll find out what this actually means. The problem is, and this is why the court system, you'll remember from your high school civics class back when civics was taught in school, that you have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The legislative branch made these laws. The judicial branch will tell us what they mean, and because it's hard to write a good law, and this one isn't particularly well written, there is going to be a tremendous amount of discretion in the hands of judges who will tell us the answer to that question. But it looks like probably you wouldn't have to give back money from March 15, 2019 through December 31st, 2019, but we're not sure.
If you have an LLC, should we also have a living trust?
These are completely different things. It's like comparing chocolate with Tuesday. It's a completely different thing. Almost everyone should have a living trust, because you thus avoid probate, you save attorney's fees, you save hassle, you have much more flexibility at a time of grief when someone has died and things are otherwise in disarray. At least you have the power at that point through the trust to conduct business and handle problems. So everything you own should be in a trust. For rental properties that generate potential liability, those should be inside an LLC, a limited liability company, because think of it like a watertight door on a ship. Something blows up in the property, it's uninsured or there's not enough insurance, you could lose the property. But if it's in an LLC, that watertight door protects everything else you have, like other properties in other LLCs, your own home, your bank accounts, your stock accounts, your bond accounts, whatever else you have is protected, because that explosion is contained inside the concrete environment of a limited liability company. Then, the limited liability company should be owned by your trust. So the property is owned by the LLC is owned by the trust, and you are the beneficiary of the trust. That's the order of the march. There's a hand up with a card in it with a question right over here for a runner who can grab it. Hand up high, please. Someone's headed toward you.
I'll take this one. How can you buy more time in a 1031 exchange so that you have more time to buy a property? So those who are not familiar with the law, actually in the folders that you received, there's a magazine in there. I lay out for you the entire 1031 exchange process. But in short, you negotiate extensions, and Rita, we did this on her exchange. You negotiate one-way extensions. You as the seller choose whether or not you'll use them, not the buyer, and you negotiate that through the negotiation process. So that's the short answer. But you do have 45 days to identify. You're trying to increase the amount of shop time you have, so you negotiate extensions of the escrow. Next question.
So right before the next question, two comments. The first is that there is absolutely no extension of the 45 days to identify. There is absolutely no extension of the 180 days. What you have just heard from Chris is an exceptional realtor. We work with literally hundreds and hundreds of realtors. This man is the apartment broker, and he understands strategies that allow you to follow the law and buy that additional time without bending those two rules, but to buy it within the negotiations with the buyer where you are the seller. And so this is the difference that a true professional who understands how the game actually works within the rules, that's good stuff.
If we do a 1031 exchange out of state, does the capital gains follow us?
So when you do a 1031 exchange, what you're doing is you're deferring the tax from property A to property B. And when you go out of state, the 1031 exchange is acceptable in all 50 states in the United States, as well as California, conforms with the 1031 exchange rules of the federal government. Now, what's important is when you go out of state, you must track and file a form with the state of California telling the state of California, I deferred my gain and I went out of state. And as long as you file that document every year, you're in compliance with the regulations of California.
Can you share some information on the step-up law, step-up in basis?
A step-up in basis is a part of the tax code where when someone passes away, the government allows you to reset the value based on the death of that individual. So for example, let's say mom was on title and you're the son and mom passes away. The date of death of mom will reset the value of the asset. So if the asset was purchased in the 70s for $30,000 and in 2019 it's worth $500,000 and mom dies in 2019, the IRS will acknowledge that the value for tax purposes is $500,000, which could yield a tax-free sale if it's sold. Now, the second definition of step-up in basis was on the slide we talked about earlier with the opportunity zone. If you hold on to the asset for 10 years and then sell the asset after the 10th year, the IRS will reset the value and charge no tax on the investment. But the state of California does not recognize that rule with opportunity zones.
So the way you pay tax, capital gains, is when you purchase the property, you have a certain tax basis in it, and that tax basis goes up and down depending on what you spend on the property, depending on how you depreciate the property, and that's the starting point. Then, at the time of sale, it's up here, you hope, and that goes up and down depending on your costs of sale and other issues, and what you pay tax on is the difference between the basis and that top number. And so you want that basis to be as high as possible, so the difference is as small as possible, and that's the overall context in which Steve's answer fits. Again, in the hands of a skilled professional, lots of different things that can be done to look at that in terms of timing.
For Gianni, with regards to Chase loans, are they still stated income loans, or will that change given the changes in the market?
Our loans are still stated income, no tax returns required. The one thing that has changed is the liquidity requirements. We are now requiring borrowers to have 9 months of payments on their entire outstanding real estate debt.
I'll bet Gil has a thought on that.
Chase is a cutting edge lender. They're big, they're strong. This is what they do. They know the market. They're much more conservative. 9 months on your whole portfolio, that's a lot of money. On some $20 million portfolios, that can be a couple $1,000,000. So we have lenders that do not have that requirement, that only need minimal reserves, maybe 3 months. The question really is, how long will these lenders stand and continue to be so aggressive? I would be very interested right now in looking at your portfolios and possibly looking at cash out refis before other lenders go to these stringent standards.
Good suggestion.
60-day notices. Is it too late to give 60-day notices given the new rent control law?
Nobody knows. The answer is, if you are going to go back, and we see, I heard a lot of people, and I heard Chris talk about this earlier, a lot of people who are just thinking, well, I won't be able as of January 1 to evict them without cause, so I'm just going to evict everybody right now, and so I can bump to market and what have you. Courts look to and promote good faith behavior according to reasonable standards. You've heard me say that today 3 times. It's a watchword as to what judges are supposed to do. It's a legal system, not a justice system, but the goal of the legal system is to do justice. And so they look at good faith to determine, were you really evicting to get around the rent control rule? If so, a judge might just very well hand you your head. But if there's a justification, a rationale that the judge looks at and says, yeah, that's reasonable, then you might be okay. To me, it's risky. There's a risk. And whether you fish in those waters or not depends on your appetite for risk. Some people say, I think it's a great idea to go skydiving and it's fun and it's exciting and it's thrilling, and I know I'll be okay. And if I'm not, I'll have a really good, exciting time on that last jump. And other people say, I will never voluntarily jump out of a perfectly good airplane, and certainly not for fun. This is taste in the merry-go-round versus the roller coaster of life. And so it depends on your individual appetite for risk. If you look and you say, I don't want a chance that I'm going to end up in a litigation, I'd rather get less rent, don't do it. If you look at it and you say, you know what, I'll take my chances. I don't think these people will sue me, and if they do, I'm prepared to take that downside, then go ahead and try it. There is not a correct answer. This is why there are 31 flavors.
Now, when I explained my Ontario deal earlier, I mentioned that Bruce's company actually did the financing. Next to no commercial lenders will lend to your direct IRA, to your 401k investment plan. Bruce has an investment or a loan for that. But Bruce, hard money, we talked about this earlier this afternoon. There's a lot of sharks in the business, almost like they're betting against investors that they'll lose their properties. What should someone look for when they're looking for hard money, the type of loans that your company offers?
You know, one thing that we have is we have a team of people with a lot of experience, which is kind of nice. And we're a hard money lender. If you heard a recording of our typical day, you would go, boy, those guys say no an awful lot. And this is typically what we hear. You know, we have somebody and they're going to buy their first thing and it's worth $300,000. They're paying $270,000 and it only needs $10,000 of work and they're going to flip it. Well, okay, so you're getting into the business to lose money. Is that your intention? Because that's about what to happen. And so, you know, we discourage people from making mistakes like that, even though we could have arranged that loan to make sense, right? Just put $100,000 down and we know you're not going to walk away and we'll be fine, but you won't be. So we do a lot of that. We have an appraiser that goes out and he's probably flipped 600 houses on his own. When he comes back and says, it's not a trust deed I would invest my money in, that's the end of the loan. It's just that simple. So we have checks and balances and a lot of experience. And so I guess that's one of our protections. And the reason it's there is that we really land on the side of the lender with the money. Then, in other words, that's our main protection. Because nothing goes simple when you have a late payment. It's a breach of trust. I mean, right now, if we have a $50 million portfolio of loans, and we don't have a portfolio, by the way, we do one loan at a time with one investor in the loan. It's kind of rare that we have 1% of our entire portfolio even late 30 days, much less a foreclosure, because we really are very careful who gets in, and it's for the benefit of both. And here it's a little bit, I mean, as far as the business model, when we have people that have, let's say, $10 million with us that haven't had a late payment for 5 years. But let's say they did a loan and they got a late payment. All of a sudden, you know, they would go, I wonder if something's changed down there. And they would start looking at things a little differently. So we really are careful about who we loan to. So anyway, we look at anything that makes sense. I mean, we don't usually do apartment loans, but we did it for you. And we did it because it made sense. And if that's what we were approached with, we would do it because it made sense. Mostly we're doing, you know, well, we can do $1 million house loan. We can certainly do $1 million loan on something like 5 units or something. It just has to make sense.
And for the rare few in the room who have been considering to sell, they're trying to gauge, do I hold for another couple of more years with everything that you know? If you had to say up or down today, is the market going up or down?
I think honestly, you're probably in for a pretty mild time both ways. I don't know how you have a really big downturn if you have interest rates as I think they're going to occur. But to me, again, that means high affordability, and I haven't seen that be matched with a really boom time in real estate. Most of the time, it's because the prices are getting hit because of unemployment going up, migration going out, and all those charts will happen to California. So, but I think because if you're in the refi business, what percentage of loans in the United States will get refied if you have a 2% house mortgage rate? I mean, 100% if it could be, and maybe even stuff that's free and clear. It'd be enticing, right? 2%, I think I can probably make a profit on that.
Right.
So anyway.
Gil, so you're a commercial loan broker, you have the pulse of multiple banks. If I'm looking for financing, what should I be looking for as I vet various lenders?
Well, number one, we look at what your objectives are. What are your objectives, short-term, long-term, and so forth. We're going to fit the right product for your objectives. So we don't want you to fit in the box. We're going to find the box for you, whether it be the ultimate best rate on a 5, 10, 3, whatever the case may be. Maybe you're looking to leverage and you like interest only for 10 years. We have that product line also. So the main thing is the interview process of what your objectives are and how we can fit the loan to be more tailor-made for your objective.
Steve, as someone's vetting accountants, what should they be looking for, number one? Number two, you work with some people with some significant high net worth. What do they do different than the average investor? Again, with real estate, the average real estate investor, what's some thoughts you can share with why they're so successful?
The key is quality control. The successful investors have quality control mechanisms in their portfolio, and they spend time in due diligence to analyze their acquisitions, as well as when they manage the property. They manage the process throughout the life cycle of that asset. And like Mr. Spurrier said, when you are a landlord, it's like a business. You want to treat every tenant like a customer, and you want a good customer service, because that long term will yield more value and more loyalty from the tenant, and less liability, less risk, which then yields potentially a higher value portfolio. And the high net worth folks are full-time investors, and they spend majority of their time and now analyzing economic conditions and underwriting deal flow.
And choosing the right accountant, what are we looking for?
To choose the right accountant is you want to look for an accountant that understands the mindset of the investor and understands real estate. For example, ask your accountant if they own real estate and what their analysis are based on their perspective as a landlord. Because it's important, being in a niche area such as real estate, to really understand what our clients are thinking and how they're thinking. So that way we can provide the correct advice, not necessarily to save money on tax, but to grow their net worth for the long term. And that's the key. It's a question to ask is, what is our after-tax rate of return? Not necessarily what's the immediate tax savings, just to save money on taxes.
Now, Gianni, your name in the San Gabriel Valley a lot of times is a household name because of the amount of business that you've done in the area. You're a landlord in the area. Gil's taking a couple shots at you, so we'll give you a shot here. You said Chase is getting a little bit more stringent in the underwriting. Why should I do business with Chase?
Because we're, as much as, Gil is touting, certain loans that are specific to certain clients. If you may have some deal with some hair on it, or certain situations that maybe need somebody who's a little more open to that. However, our certainty of execution is second to none. When you get a proposal from us, with myself, 99 times out of 100, we're going to deliver on that, number one. Secondary, we're in this market. We understand this market. We don't under-promise, over-deliver. And going in that our process is the easiest in the business. I don't think there's any big apartment owners out there that will say that, that we're anything but the easiest to work with in terms of ease of just doing the application, no need for tax returns. Our applications are simple. We just got a very streamlined process and can close deal in 30 days.
According to tonight's debate rules, Gil gets 30 seconds to respond.
I'm not here to talk down Chase. Chase is a great bank. Gianni's a great loan officer. There's no question. What I can say is this. Their guidelines have changed. They're at a 120 debt service. I have lenders at 115. They do have an easy process, stated income. We have 3 other lenders at stated income. We don't have a 9-month liquidity issue whatsoever. They're the only bank right now that are requesting 9-month liquidity on the whole portfolio. So that being said, they could be on the cutting edge, but when they're off the market, they are off the market. And right now, they're definitely off the market.
Fight.
And truth be told,
Chris, really quickly, off the market, maybe, like I said, our requirements are a little different than some of Gil's other lenders. However, as a bank, we closed $2 billion in loans last month alone. This year, we'll hit $20 billion in loans. So we're not out of the market. We're just a little more stringent.
In all fairness, I give a lot of business to Chase, a lot of business to Gil. It's dependent upon the deal and the investor at the end of the day. But if you're going to go to Chase, there's none better than Gianni. And if you're looking for multiple bids, if you will, on your loan, there's no better commercial loan broker, honestly, than Gil. Not because they're affiliated with us. It's just, this is who we direct our personal clients to. Now, Mr. Spear, real estate attorneys, sorry, most of us don't like you. But if we need one, how do we pick one?
So first of all, you know what happens if you give Viagra to a male attorney. He gets taller. It'll come to you in a few minutes. So two things I would say is, number one, you want someone who, it's their field of expertise. If you go to a lawyer and the lawyer says, sure, I do traffic crash and drunk driving and divorce and international taxation, and I do my share of real estate, that's probably not a real estate lawyer who knows really the ins and outs. So that would be the one thing. The second thing would be, you want a lawyer who you can, and I would say the same thing when you're talking to someone about taxes or loans, financing, the purchase or sale of real estate. You want someone who makes sense when they talk. You want someone who, when you ask the question, you understand the answer. Because there's no mountaintop knowledge involved in anything that any of us do. And if we can't explain it, then it does you no good. So you want someone who you can ask questions of. We have many clients who have consultation accounts with us where they call and we bill in 6-minute increments, and you get what you pay for and you pay for what you get. We have some clients who we hear from 3 times a week and others we don't hear from for 8 months, 10 months. If you have access where you can get quick questions answered, that's worth it. So picking your lawyer is someone who focuses on it, someone who you can understand. And then let me ask you, when someone is looking for a realtor to represent them in the purchase or the sale or the exchange of their apartment complex or other real estate, how should they pick what should they look for in a realtor?
I think the bottom line is the exposure that your property receives equals that many more offers, and more offers equals price. So it comes down to the breadth and depth of their marketing and what exposure your property's receiving. In terms of advice, exchange, and what have you, do they have skin in the game? Do they own multifamily property? Or is it all just about commission? Do they know what it's like to take calls as a landlord versus just pushing you to invest more when they don't know the reality of what they're asking you to do? So I think it's also the practicality of being a landlord themselves. Now, how many of you would agree that this afternoon was worth the cost of your free lunch? Worth the cost of your free lunch?
I want to say and call for one more round of applause for Chris, who puts this together. This takes a tremendous amount of organization. And those of us who serve on this panel do so because we believe in each other and we believe in Chris. So, Chris German, great job.
I know we went a little long. Do not fear. I know there's a lot of questions we didn't get to. The panel is always good about the fact that I'm going to email them. I'm going to put all the questions together in a Word doc. We're going to email the panel. They respond. And if I have your email, I'm going to send the answers to all the questions that went unanswered. So do not fear. For those of you that want to reach out to Steve Hall, these information cards, please make sure you get these in so that he knows who to contact and who to get the right information to. And again, I'll close with this. If you own property in your personal name and it should be in an LLC or a trust, please make the right move. If you have financing that's variable and you should look at something fixed while rates are competitive, please look at your loans. Whatever amount of information you receive from this stage, the point is, please do something. That's why we're here this afternoon, to serve you. Thank you. One more round of applause for our panel that was involved this afternoon. If you thought this was seamless and a good process, please one more round of applause for my assistant, Matt, Frank, and the rest of my staff. And we thank you and have a good afternoon. If you need a parking voucher, you'll get those on the way out. Thank you.